Before we dive into this chilling story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more real and spine-tingling accounts to life. The wind howled through the towering redwoods, carrying with it a bone-chilling cold that seemed to creep into every crack and crevice of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. The snow fell steadily, blanketing the trails in pristine white and muffling the world into an eerie silence. Liam Carter, wrapped in his thick ranger jacket, adjusted his scarf and tugged his hat lower over his ears. At 22, he was the youngest park ranger on the team, his youthful energy offset by a surprising level of dedication and seriousness about his job. "Always check in on the hour, Liam," his supervisor, Gerald Price, had reminded him that morning. Gerald, a grizzled veteran of the park, had a knack for sensing trouble before it arrived. "Winter's no joke out here. One mistake, and you could be an ice statue by the time we find you." "I'll be fine, Gerald," Liam had replied, his boyish grin breaking through the cold. "This place isn't as scary as you make it sound." But now, alone in the vast wilderness, Liam wasn't so sure. The forest seemed alive in the winter, not with the vibrant energy of wildlife, but with an oppressive stillness that pressed against his senses. Every crunch of snow under his boots echoed unnaturally, as though the trees were listening. Liam's patrol route that day took him to a less-traveled area of the park, a stretch known as the Shadow Basin. The name alone was enough to deter most visitors, especially in winter. Few ventured here even in the warmer months, and now, with the trails buried under a foot of snow, Liam knew he'd likely be the only soul for miles. He paused at a clearing to catch his breath. Above him, the canopy of sequoias swayed gently, their massive trunks groaning like ancient sentinels. The park was beautiful in its starkness, the kind of beauty that demanded respect and fear. Fishing his radio out of his coat, Liam checked in. "Station, this is Ranger Carter. No activity on the Shadow Basin Trail. All quiet," Gerald's voice crackled back. "Copy that, Carter. Don't wander too far off the path. Snowstorms picking up." "Will do," Liam replied, clipping the radio back onto his belt. His breath misted in the frigid air as he scanned the clearing one last time. The trees stood like monuments, their shadows long and dark against the snow. Satisfied, he moved on. The deeper he ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The stillness was no longer calming, it was suffocating. The occasional rustle of branches above made him glance upward, his hand instinctively brushing the handle of his flashlight. But there was nothing, just the wind and the weight of the forest. Then he sighed. A faint trail of footprints, half covered by fresh snow, veered off the main path. Liam froze, his heart quickening. The tracks were small, almost dainty, as if they'd been made by a child or someone wearing lightweight boots. But what child would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, with a storm brewing? Kneeling, Liam examined the prints more closely. They led toward the creek, zigzagging as if their maker had been wandering aimlessly. He followed them for a few yards, curiosity overtaking caution. The prints stopped abruptly at the water's edge, where the creek had frozen solid. He crouched down, inspecting the ice. There were no cracks, no signs that someone had fallen through. The trail simply ended, as if the person had vanished into thin air. Liam frowned, glancing over his shoulder at the darkening forest. The shadows seemed deeper now, the trees more imposing. His instincts whispered that something was wrong, but he brushed it off. Maybe the snowstorm had obscured the rest of the trail. Or maybe the person had turned back, their return steps erased by the snowfall. Shrugging, Liam returned to the main trail, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. He was trained to notice details, and the abruptness of the footprints bothered him. He made a mental note to mention it to Gerald later, though he already knew the response. Probably some hiker who got scared off by the weather. The rest of the patrol was uneventful, but Liam couldn't ignore the oppressive silence. Normally, even in winter, the park had its sounds: distant bird calls, the occasional cracking of ice, the soft rustle of animals in the underbrush. But now, there was nothing. Only the sound of his own breathing and the crunch of his boots on the snow. When he finally made it back to the station at dusk, the warm glow of the ranger's cabin felt like a sanctuary. Gerald was waiting for him, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Anything interesting out there?" Gerald asked, eyeing him with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Just footprints," Liam said, collapsing into a chair near the fireplace. "Weird ones. Stopped at the creek like the person disappeared." Gerald grunted, his expression unreadable. "Keep an eye out tomorrow. Storm's supposed to get worse." Liam nodded, sipping his coffee. The warmth seeped into his bones, but it did little to chase away the unease that had taken root. He didn't know it then, but that day's patrol would mark the beginning of something far darker than he could have imagined. The forest stretched before Liam Carter like an ancient cathedral, its towering redwoods forming columns that seemed to scrape the sky. The snow lay thick and pristine, muting every sound beneath its icy blanket. Liam's boots crunched as he walked, the sound stark against the profound silence of the wilderness. The air was sharp and cold, biting at his cheeks and leaving a crystalline frost on his breath. It was late afternoon, though the dense canopy above stole much of the daylight, casting the forest floor into shadow. Liam paused at the edge of a narrow trail, pulling his radio from his belt to check in. Static buzzed in his ear as he pressed the button. "This is Carter. North Ridge Trail is clear. Moving east toward the creek," he said, his voice steady but hushed, as if afraid to disturb the quiet. The response crackled in his ear. "Copy that, Carter. Keep an eye out for ice patches. Last storm left some tricky spots." "Will do," Liam replied, tucking the radio back into its holder. As he turned, something caught his eye, a disturbance in the otherwise unbroken snow. Frowning, he crouched to examine it. Footprints. The tracks were faint, half-filled with snow, but unmistakably human. They veered off the main trail, leading into the dense, unmarked woods. Liam's brow furrowed as he studied them. "Odd," he murmured to himself. It wasn't unusual for hikers to stray off course, but the park had been closed to the public for days due to the storm. Who would have been out here, and why? The footprints were uneven, as though the person had been walking with a limp, or perhaps running. They continued deeper into the forest, their pattern erratic, suggesting confusion or fear. Liam straightened, his gloved hand resting instinctively on the flashlight strapped to his belt. His instincts told him to report the find, but curiosity tugged at him like a child pulling on a sleeve. If someone was out here, they could be in trouble, or worse, already hurt. He adjusted the strap of his pack, his breath visible in the frigid air, as he stepped off the trail and followed the tracks. The forest seemed to change as Liam ventured further. The air grew colder, and the trees pressed closer together, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal hands. The trail of footprints became harder to follow, partially obscured by drifting snow. Liam stopped abruptly, his pulse quickening. The tracks had ended. In front of him, the snow was undisturbed, a smooth, unbroken sheet as though no one had ever been there. Liam glanced around, his breath shallow, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "How long?" he called, his voice echoing faintly before being swallowed by the silence. Nothing. A sharp crack sounded behind him, like a branch snapping underfoot. Liam spun, his flashlight in hand, its beam slicing through the shadows. The forest appeared unchanged, but the sound had been close, too close. "How long?" He tried again, louder this time. The stillness pressed down on him like a weight. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though he saw no one. He crouched to examine the snow where the tracks ended. The edges of the last footprint were clean, as though the person had simply vanished mid-step. No sign of a scuffle, no drag marks, nothing. It didn't make sense. As the light began to fade, Liam realized he needed to head back. The forest wasn't a place to be caught after dark, especially in winter. He marked the spot with a strip of red tape from his pack, tying it to a low-hanging branch. "I'll come back tomorrow," he muttered, his voice almost a whisper. As he retraced his steps toward the main trail, Liam couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The forest seemed darker now, the silence heavier. Once or twice, he thought he heard faint whispers, soft and indistinct, carried on the wind. He stopped to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it came. By the time he reached the ranger station, the sky had turned a bruised shade of purple. Liam logged his patrol and noted the footprints in his report, though he didn't mention the whispers or the track's abrupt end. It sounded too strange, too unexplainable. But as he sat in the station's warmth, sipping a cup of coffee, Liam's mind kept returning to that spot in the woods. The footprints, the silence, and the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching him. He told himself it was just the isolation getting to him, a trick of the mind. Yet deep down, he knew he'd be returning to the woods the next day, not just because it was his job, but because the mystery gnawed him, demanding answers. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, something waited. The forest was a different beast tonight. During the day, the towering redwoods stood like ancient sentinels, majestic and unwavering. But under the dim light of the crescent moon, their silhouettes twisted into dark, foreboding shades that seemed to lean closer as Liam walked beneath them. Snow crunched under his boots, muffled and hesitant, as though the forest itself was urging him to tread lightly. Liam adjusted his flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the shadows. It was his third winter patrolling Sequoia, but something about this season felt wrong. He couldn't shake the growing unease that clung to him like the biting chill of the wind. The silence pressed down on him, heavy and unnatural. No rustling leaves, no distant calls of nocturnal creatures, just an oppressive quiet that made his own breathing seem too loud. He paused for a moment, scanning his surroundings. His breath plumed in front of him, a ghostly cloud that dissipated into the darkness. The forest felt alive in a way that wasn't comforting. The trees seemed to hum with a low, imperceptible frequency, as though communicating in a language he couldn't understand. He told himself it was just the wind, but the air was still. Too still. His radio crackled briefly, a sharp burst of static that made him jump. He exhaled sharply and unclipped it from his belt. "Carter to base," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. There was no response. He frowned and tried again. "Base, this is Carter. Do you copy?" Only static. "Probably the interference," he muttered, slipping the radio back onto his belt. The terrain in this part of the park was notorious for spotty communication, but it felt inconveniently timed. Liam pressed on, shining his flashlight across the trees. That's when he heard it. A sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible. It wasn't a snap of a branch or the rustle of an animal. It was something different. A whisper. He froze, his heart thudding in his chest. The sound came again, soft and fleeting, carried on the still air. It was as if the forest itself was exhaling words, just out of reach of comprehension. "How long?" Liam called, his voice trembling despite himself. He hated how small it sounded in the vast emptiness around him. The whisper stopped. Liam strained his ears, his pulse hammering in his head. He swept his flashlight across the trees, searching for movement, for anything. But the forest stared back at him, unmoving and unyielding. "It's just the wind," he said aloud, more to hear his own voice than to convince himself. He forced his legs to move, one deliberate step after another, but the whispering returned. This time, it was closer, louder. A single syllable, a breath of a word he couldn't decipher. Liam turned sharply, his flashlight trembling in his grasp. "Who's there?" he shouted, the authority in his voice masking the fear clawing at his chest. The beam of light caught something, just for a second. A flicker of movement between the trees. A shadow that didn't belong. He swung the flashlight back, but it was gone. His stomach twisted into knots. He reached for his radio again, his fingers fumbling in the cold. "Carter the base," he said, louder this time. "I think I've got someone out here. Maybe a lost hiker. Requesting backup." Silence. The static didn't even crackle this time. The line was dead. Liam cursed under his breath. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and drew his knife from its sheath, a precaution more for his own sense of safety than anything else. The whispering stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving the forest in suffocating silence once more. Liam stayed where he was, scanning the area around him. Every instinct told him to turn back, to head to the safety of the ranger station. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone needed him to stay. His flashlight caught another shape in the snow ahead. Footprints. Liam crouched to inspect them. They were fresh, the indentations crisp against the snow. But something about them didn't make sense. They were barefoot. The prints were small, too small to belong to any adult. "What the hell?" he whispered, glancing around. The trail led deeper into the forest, disappearing into the darkness. Liam's breath hitched as he stared at the path. His pulse quickened, and for the first time, the vastness of the wilderness felt suffocating. Then he heard it again. The whisper. Closer now, directly behind him. Liam whipped around, his flashlight jerking in his hand. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the forest, watching in silence. For the first time in his career, Liam Carter felt truly, deeply afraid. The wind howled low and steady as Liam Carter adjusted the strap of his heavy pack, his breath misting in the biting December air. The forest around him was still, save for the soft crunch of his boots against the snow-covered ground. The towering redwoods loomed like silent sentinels, their massive trunks blotting out what little light the overcast sky provided. It was late afternoon, and the pale gray sun hung low, promising an early and frigid night. Liam raised his radio to his lips, his gloved hand fumbling with the switch. The static buzzed faintly before he spoke. "Base, this is Carter. I'm heading toward the northern ridge to check the storm damage from last week. Should be back before nightfall, but I'll keep you updated. Over. The reply came after a brief pause, crackling with the interference of distance. Copy that, Carter. Weather's turning faster than expected. Don't push it. Come back if visibility drops. Over. He smiled faintly, his cheeks stinging from the cold. The concern in the voice of the senior ranger, Tim, was evident. Tim always warned him about taking unnecessary risks, but Liam had brushed it off. He knew the trails better than anyone, or so he thought. And something about this part of the park, the quiet beauty of it, called to him like a siren song. Will do, base. Over and out. He clipped the radio to his belt, its reassuring weight tapping lightly against his hip as he resumed his trek. The northern ridge was one of the least traveled sections of the park, especially in winter. The snowdrifts were deeper here, and the trails more treacherous. But it was also breathtakingly serene, untouched by the footprint of tourists. As he climbed, the trees grew denser, their gnarled roots breaking through the frozen earth like the bones of some ancient beast. The wind died down, replaced by an uncanny silence. Not even the chirp of a bird or the rustle of branches disturbed the air. Liam paused, his breath catching, not from exertion, but from the weight of the stillness. He looked up, the forest canopy stretching endlessly above, a labyrinth of skeletal branches blocking out the sky. He shook off the unease that crept into his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd been unnerved by the forest silence. The park in winter had a way of playing tricks on even the most seasoned ranger. Still, he reached for his radio again, hesitating before speaking. Base, it's Carter. Just letting you know I've reached the ridge. Everything looks clear so far. Might take a quick detour to the east trail to check the tree line before heading back. Over. The static response was brief but clear. Roger that. Keep it quick, Carter. Weather's shifting fast. Over and out. Sliding the radio back onto his belt, Liam scanned the horizon. The snow stretched endlessly, the landscape painted in shades of white and gray. He decided to take the detour, a short loop that would bring him back to the main trail. It was a route he'd walked dozens of times before, though never in the dead of winter. As he descended into the ravine, the air grew colder, biting through his thick jacket. The shadows lengthened, twisting into jagged shades that seemed to move in the periphery of his vision. He stopped abruptly, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck rise. There he was again, that sensation of being watched. How long? His voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the trees. Nothing. Shaking his head, he continued. It was just the isolation getting to him, he told himself. He needed to finish his patrol and head back before darkness claimed the forest. The trail narrowed, hemmed in by thick underbrush. He noticed something strange ahead, a disturbance in the snow. A single, perfectly straight line carved into the ground, as if something heavy had been dragged through. It disappeared into the trees. Liam knelt down, examining the line closely. No footprints accompanied it, no evidence of an animal or human presence. Just that long, unbroken groove. His radio crackled unexpectedly, startling him. He grabbed it quickly, expecting Tim's voice to come through. But there was only static. Base, this is Carter. Do you copy? His voice was steady, but his pulse quickened. The static grew louder, hissing unnaturally before cutting off altogether. Liam frowned, tapping the device and checking the signal. The radio wasn't damaged, but it was silent now, as if the frequencies themselves had been swallowed by the forest. He stood, scanning the trees around him. The silence pressed against his ears, deafening in its weight. His gut told him to turn back, to leave the ridge and report what he found. But his curiosity won out. Pulling out his flashlight, he followed the line into the woods, his heart pounding with each step. The shadows seemed to thicken, the trees leaning closer together, as though conspiring to trap him. The groove in the snow ended abruptly at the base of a massive tree, its trunk scarred with deep, jagged marks. They were claw marks. Liam knew the signs of predators well. These were deliberate, carved with purpose. He raised his flashlight higher, tracing the marks up the tree. They formed strange, angular patterns, almost like runes, but not like anything he'd seen before. A chill ran down his spine, and he suddenly felt very small in the vast expanse of the forest. Behind him, the snow crunched faintly. Liam spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, just the endless trees. His breathing quickened as the sound came again, this time closer. "How long?" he called again, his voice trembling slightly. No answer. The silence that followed was absolute, more oppressive than before. It wrapped around him, thick and suffocating. Liam's fingers tightened around the flashlight as he backed away from the tree. He fumbled for his radio, desperate to hear a voice, any voice. "Base, this is Carter. I need assistance. Do you copy? Base, do you copy?" The radio remained silent. Then, just as he turned to leave, the faintest whisper reached his ears. It wasn't words, just a sound, soft and fleeting, like a breath of wind through the branches. But it was enough to freeze him in his tracks. Liam's instinct screamed at him to run. And so, for the first time in his career, he obeyed. He didn't stop to look back as he plunged through the snow, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly. His radio slid from his belt, falling into the white abyss, but he didn't care. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him completely was the whisper again, closer this time, impossibly close. And then silence. The sun was a pale, cold disk barely cutting through the slate-gray sky as the search party assembled at the ranger station. Frost clung stubbornly to the ground, crunching beneath heavy boots. The air smelled faintly of pine and impending snow, a cruel reminder that time was running out. Liam Carter had been missing for 18 hours. The head ranger, Tom Rourke, stood grim-faced before the assembled group. His voice was steady, but carried the weight of growing dread. "Liam's last check-in was yesterday afternoon. He said he was heading toward the North Ridge, near the old game trail. That's where we start." Among the group were seasoned rangers, their faces etched with worry, and a handful of volunteers, hikers, who had postponed their adventures to aid the search. A cacophony of radios crackling, dogs barking, and snowmobiles revving filled the station yard as town divided them into smaller teams. The snow deepened as the teams ventured into the park. The towering redwoods loomed like silent sentinels, their massive trunks creating a labyrinth of shadows. Liam's disappearance weighed heavily on the group. He was no rookie. A capable ranger, fit and sharp, Liam knew this part better than anyone. The volunteers whispered among themselves as they trudged through the snow. "Think he just got lost?" one asked, adjusting his scarf. "No way. Not Liam. Maybe an accident?" Behind them, another muttered. "Or maybe he found something he shouldn't have." Team Alpha reached the creek where Liam had last been seen. The frigid water ran sluggishly beneath a thin veil of ice. It was here they found the first sign, Liam's flashlight, perched on a rock at the water's edge. Its metal casing was icy to the touch, as if abandoned only hours ago. Tom crouched beside it, his gloved hand brushing the surface. "It is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But why would he leave it here?" Nearby, a search dog barked sharply, pawing at the snow. The group hurried over, their breath visible in the freezing air. The dog had uncovered a piece of fabric, dark green, torn, and unmistakably from a ranger's coat. Tom held it up, his expression hardening. "We are close. Keep moving." As the team pressed on, the forest grew darker, the towering canopy blocking what little light remained. The deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the silence became. There were no birds, no rustling of squirrels, no wind whispering through the branches. Only the crunch of boots on snow and the occasional hiss of a radio. Then came the footprints. "Over here," a ranger called, pointing to a shallow impression in the snow. The group gathered around, studying the tracks. They were human, the size of Lynn's boots. But they were strange. The footprints seemed hesitant, meandering, almost aimless. They veered off the main trail, weaving between trees before abruptly stopping in the middle of a clearing. "No way, he just stopped," said one of the volunteers. Tom knelt beside the tracks, running his fingers over the edges of the print. "There's no sign of struggle, no sign of him turning back." He paused, his brow furrowing. "It's like he just vanished." As night began to fall, Team Alpha stumbled upon an ancient redwood. Its bark was scarred with deep, deliberate gashes, vertical slashes that formed no discernible pattern. The fresh cuts contrasted sharply against the weathered wood, their edges raw and unnatural. "What the hell is this?" one ranger muttered, running his hand over the scars. Tom's radio crackled, breaking the tense silence. "Team Beta here. We've got nothing on our end." Heading back, Tom hesitated, staring at the marks. "Copy that," he said, his tone heavy. "We'll regroup at the station." The team retraced their steps, the forest now an oppressive black void around them. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating only fragments of the path. Their unease grew with every step, as though the forest itself had turned against them. They emerged from the trees hours later, frostbitten and exhausted. Back at the station, Tom spread the collected clues across the table. The flashlight, the torn fabric, and a crude sketch of the tree's markings. One volunteer spoke up, his voice trembling. "You think he's still out there?" Tom didn't answer. He stared at the map, his jaw tight. "We go back at first light," he said finally. "We're not giving up on him." But as the team disbanded for the night, an unspoken fear settled over them all. Something was wrong with this search, something they couldn't quite name. And deep in the forest, the silence stretched on, as if it had swallowed Liam Carter whole. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Thick snow muffled the searchers' footsteps as they trudged deeper into the wilderness. The trees loomed over them like silent sentinels, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. Despite the biting cold, sweat beaded on the brows of the search team, not from exertion, but from the weight of an inexplicable dread that seemed to radiate from the woods. Deputy Sarah Grayson, the team leader, called for a halt. She knelt by a tree that stood out starkly from the others, an ancient giant, its bark gnarled and split as if time itself had tried to tear it apart. Something about the tree drew her in. As she ran her gloved hand over its rough surface, her fingers froze mid-motion. There were markings. Carved deep into the bark were symbols, alien in design, forming no recognizable pattern. They were random scratches or the handiwork of wildlife. These marks were deliberate, precise, etched with a force that suggested a sharp blade or something far stronger. The symbol seemed to twist unnaturally under the dim light, as if the very act of looking at them made them shift slightly, subtly, like shadows flickering at the edge of perception. "What the hell is this?" muttered Mark Tilden, another ranger, as he stepped closer. His voice cracked, the usual confidence replaced by unease. "Looks like someone's idea of a prank," Sarah replied, though her tone lacked conviction. "Ian, I don't know." She stood and glanced around, the uneasy feeling gnawing at her gut. The woods had grown unnervingly quiet. Not even the wind dared to stir the trees. It was as if they were being watched. A sharp cry from another searcher broke the spell. "Over here! You need to see this." The group rushed toward the voice, their movements hurried but cautious, as though the forest itself had become hostile ground. When they reached the source of the call, they froze in unison. Before them lay a perfect circle of snow, untouched and pristine, about 10 feet in diameter. The surrounding snow was uneven, trampled by boots and scattered with fallen branches. But the circle, its edges so precise they might have been drawn with a compass, was eerily undisturbed. In the center, the ground was bare, exposing the frozen soil beneath. "Did someone clear this?" asked one of the younger rangers, his voice trembling. "No," Sarah said. "This doesn't make sense. Look at the edges. Not a single flake of snow has fallen into the circle. It's impossible." The group exchanged uneasy glances. A few of them shuffled backward instinctively, their breaths fogging in the icy air. Mark knelt beside the circle, reaching out hesitantly toward the bare earth. "Don't touch it," Sarah snapped, startling everyone, including herself. She couldn't explain the urgency in her voice, only that the sight of the circle filled her with a visceral sense of wrongness. Mark hesitated, then pulled his hand back, his face pale. "What could do this?" someone asked. No one answered. As they stood there, the silence pressed down on them like a weight. It wasn't the silence of an empty forest, but something far deeper, almost alive. It seemed to thrum in their ears, vibrating just below the threshold of hearing. Sarah felt her heart pounding, a primal urge to run warring with her professional instincts. She forced herself to speak. "Mark the location and take photos. We'll document this and report back." As Mark snapped pictures, the others kept their distance, huddling together as though proximity could ward off the unease. When Sarah looked up at the ancient tree with the markings, she swore the symbol seemed angrier, their jagged lines appearing deeper and more defined than before. She shook her head. It must be the light, or her nerves. The team lingered only long enough to gather evidence, then quickly retreated from the site. The forest remained oppressively silent as they left, and each step away felt like peeling free from an invisible grip. When they finally broke through to a clearing, the tension eased, but no one spoke of what they had found. They didn't need to. The terror was etched on every face. As they packed up their gear for the day, Sarah glanced back toward the direction of the tree and the circle. She couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't stumbled upon something random, that they had intruded on something ancient and deliberate. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. That night, as the searchers slept in the ranger station, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, carrying a sound like whispers, like voices, like laughter. But when Sarah woke with a start and looked outside, there was nothing but the forest, dark and endless, watching and waiting. The forest seemed to close in around the search party, its towering redwoods casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. The quiet was suffocating, too quiet, even for winter. No birds, no distant rustle of animals, only the sound of boots crunching through snow and the occasional murmured conversation. Each step took them deeper into the ancient heart of the park, where the trees seemed older, taller, and more indifferent to human intrusion. Ranger Sandra Coleman led the group, her jaw clenched against the creeping unease gnawing in her. She worked the park for 15 years and thought she'd seen it all. Lost hikers, bear attacks, even an avalanche rescue. But this felt different. She glanced at the others. 4 men, including Tom Harris, a seasoned tracker, and 2 volunteers, both visibly nervous. They hadn't said much since stumbling upon the strange markings earlier that day. "Stay close," Sandra ordered, her voice firm but low. It barely broke the oppressive silence. Her flashlight beam swept across the trees, illuminating bark carved with deep, unnatural gashes. "This forest has tricks. It'll make you think you're alone when you're not." Tom snorted softly, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Alone's the least of our worries, Sandra." Behind them, one of the volunteers, Ryan, a college student who had signed up for search and rescue training only weeks before, paused to catch his breath. He bent over, hands on his knees, and stared into the dense shadows beyond the trail. "I swear I saw something," Brian muttered, barely audible. "When was that?" Sandra stopped and turned to him, her flashlight sweeping across his pale face. Ryan straightened, reluctant to speak but unable to shake the feeling. "Back there, between the trees. Movement. Could have been an animal, I guess, but..." He trailed off, his eyes wide and uncertain. Sandra exchanged a glance with Tom, who gave a small shrug. "Mountain lion, maybe," Tom said. "They're curious, but they won't bother us as long as we're allowed." Ryan nodded, but the unease lingered. He couldn't describe it, but what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen, wasn't an animal. It was tall, unnaturally still, like a shadow that didn't belong. The group pressed on, following a faint trail of broken branches and depressions in the snow. Sandra's thoughts returned to the stories she'd heard over the years, shared in hushed tones around the station's fireplace. Disappearances. Voices in the wind. A ranger who had walked into the forest one day and never returned. They were ghost stories, she'd always told herself, fabrications to pass the long, lonely nights. But now, every snap of a branch and every flicker of movement at the edge of her vision felt like confirmation. They reached a small clearing where the snow was undisturbed, pristine under the pale light of the moon. In the center of the clearing stood a single redwood, its trunk massive and gnarled. Tom approached first, his steps hesitant, as if some invisible boundary held him back. "Look at this," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. The others gathered around, their breath catching as they saw the markings on the tree. Unlike the gashes from earlier, these were deliberate, symbols carved deep into the bark, their edges clean and precise despite the tree's rough surface. Circles within circles, arrows pointing in no discernible direction. Strange lines that almost formed letters, but didn't belong to any language they knew. "What the hell is this?" one of the volunteers whispered. "Trail markers?" Ryan offered weakly, though he knew better. Tom shook his head. "No, these are natural. Someone or something put them here." Sandra reached out, brushing her gloved fingers against the carvings. The wood felt cold, colder than it should, as if the tree itself rejected their presence. A chill ran down her spine, and she pulled back quickly, her heartbeat quickening. "Whatever it is, we keep moving," Sandra said, her tone clipped. "We're here for Liam, not." A loud crack split the air, echoing through the forest like a gunshot. The group froze, their flashlights swinging wildly. Ryan yelped, dropping his light, which sputtered and died in the snow. For a moment, no one spoke, their breath coming in rapid puffs. "When was that?" one of the volunteers hissed. "Tree branch," Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Was it?" Sandra shot back. Her hand hovered near the radio on her belt, though she doubted it would help. "Everyone, stay together." The group clustered closer as they moved forward, their nerves fraying with every step. Shadows shifted in the corners of their eyes, and faint whispers seemed to drift on the wind, just beyond the range of comprehension. Sandra forced herself to focus on the trail, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. By the time they reached the creek, the group was exhausted and on edge. The water was frozen solid, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of glass. Sandra scanned the area, hoping for any sign of Liam. Instead, her light caught something else, a faint outline of footprints in the snow, leading toward the forest's edge. They weren't Liam's boots. They were larger and deeper, as though someone or something much heavier had walked there recently. Tom crouched to examine them, his brow furrowing. "These don't make sense," he said. "Too deep for a person, but too precise for an animal." "Let's mark the location and move," Sandra said, though her voice wavered. "We'll report this back to base." As they turned to leave, Ryan glanced back over his shoulder. His flashlight flickered, its beam cutting through the dark. For a moment, he thought he saw it again. Something tall, something long, standing among the trees. But when he blinked, it was gone. "Come on, kid," Tom called, his voice strained. "Don't fall behind." Ryan hesitated, his heart pounding, before hurrying to catch up. The forest seemed to exhale behind them, the shadows melting back into the trees, leaving the clearing empty and silent once more. The forest was unnaturally quiet as the search team gathered near the creek where Liam's flashlight had been found days earlier. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the trees, even as the late afternoon sun attempted to penetrate the thick canopy of redwoods. The group of 6 rangers stood in a loose circle, their breath visible in the frigid air. Each of them was weighed down by layers of gear and the collective exhaustion of weeks of searching. "Over here," called Officer Garcia, a seasoned ranger whose voice was hoarse from calling Liam's name over and over. He crouched by what appeared to be an overgrown path leading away from the creek, obscured by thick ferns and years of fallen pine needles. The team gathered around. It was a trail, but not one marked on any of their maps. "Could have been an old logging road," Garcia muttered, brushing away the undergrowth to reveal a faint indentation in the earth. "But it doesn't look like anyone's used it in decades." Ranger Daniels, the youngest of the group, shivered as he stared down the faint path. "Why would Liam come this way? It doesn't make sense." "It doesn't matter why," interjected Chief Ranger Holloway. His voice carried authority, but even he couldn't disguise the tension etched into his weathered face. "If there's any chance he took this trail, we follow it." The team fell into formation, their boots crunching softly against the frosty ground. The trail wound deeper into the forest, its presence barely discernible, as though it resisted being found. Every step seemed to take them further from the safety of familiarity and deeper into an oppressive silence. The further they ventured, the more the forest seemed to change. The air grew colder, the towering redwoods casting shadows that stretched like skeletal fingers across the trail. The usual sounds of wildlife, chirping birds, rustling leaves, were conspicuously absent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ranger Daniels broke the silence. "This doesn't feel right. Keep moving," Calloway ordered, but even his voice had lost some of its usual steadiness. The trail began to narrow, forcing them to walk single file. The ground beneath their feet grew uneven, dotted with jagged rocks and roots that seemed to reach up to trip them. The trees pressed closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining like twisted arms. Then they came to a clearing. The team stopped in unison, their flashlights cutting through the gathering twilight. In the center of the clearing was a massive redwood tree, its trunk scarred with deep, deliberate gashes. The markings were unlike anything the Rangers had ever seen, neither animal claw marks nor the result of weathering. They formed intricate patterns, spirals, and symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering beams of light. "What the hell is this?" Garcia whispered, his voice barely audible. No one answered. The clearing felt wrong, as though it existed outside the natural order of the forest. The air was thick, heavy, and every breath seemed to weigh them down. Holloway stepped closer to the tree, his flashlight tracing the strange carvings. "Could be some kind of Native American symbols," he suggested, though his tone betrayed uncertainty. Daniel shook his head. "No. I've studied local tribes. This isn't their style. It's something else." The group's unease grew. Around the base of the tree, the snow formed a perfect circle, pristine and undisturbed, as though the clearing itself refused to let anything mar its surface. "I don't like this," murmured Ranger Harris, a stoic man who rarely spoke during their searches. His hand instinctively rested on the grip of his hunting knife. They all felt it, an oppressive sense of being watched. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, and the beam of their flashlights no longer felt strong enough to push them back. "Let's move," Calloway ordered, his voice tight. "We'll mark the spot and come back later." As the team turned to leave, Daniels let out a sharp gasp. "Wait, did you see that?" Everyone froze, their flashlights swinging wildly to where Daniels was pointing. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though a figure had been standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. But it was gone now, if it had ever been there at all. "You're seeing things?" Garcia muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Daniels replied, though his hand shook as he adjusted his flashlight. The team hurried back down the trail, their formation tighter than before. The oppressive silence followed them, pressing against their backs like an unseen force. As they reached the main path again, Garcia stopped and turned back toward the forgotten trail. "I don't think this place wants us here," he said quietly. Holloway shot him a sharp look. "It's just a damn forest, Garcia. Let's get back to base." But as the team trudged away, each of them couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching them, something that didn't belong in their neatly ordered world of maps and patrols. And deep in the forest, beyond the reach of their flashlights, the clearing remained as it was, untouched, waiting and silent. The snow-covered expanse of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park stretched out in eerie silence, the towering redwoods standing as ancient sentinels against the creeping cold. The search for Liam Carter had officially come to an end, but for those who had scoured the park's labyrinthine trails and frozen clearings, the sense of failure lingered like a bitter chill in the air. Winter's grip tightened, burying the forest in an even deeper shroud of mystery. days turned into weeks. The search and rescue teams packed their gear, the hum of their radios replaced by the unrelenting stillness of nature. Volunteers went back to their lives, their hopeful determination eroded by the fatigue and fruitless effort. Yet the forest seemed indifferent. Snowfall concealed footprints, erasing the paths where Liam had last tread. The once prominent clues, his flashlight, the torn piece of his coat, were now meaningless artifacts in a story with no resolution. For his fellow rangers, however, it wasn't so simple. Liam's absence was a gaping void, a question mark that refused to fade. Some clung to rational explanations. He must have lost his way, succumbed to the elements, or been attacked by an animal. But others whispered darker theories, unable to shake the unease they had felt during the search. The odd markings on the trees, the perfectly undisturbed circle of snow, the sense of being watched. Miles away from the ranger station, Liam's cabin stood undisturbed. His boots, still caked with dried mud from his last known patrol, sat by the door. On the small table in the corner, an open book lay face down, its spine creased, a sign of a life interrupted mid-thought. His radio rested on the counter, its battery drained long ago. To enter the space was to feel his presence, as though he might walk in at any moment, brushing the snow off his shoulders and grinning with an apology for worrying everyone. But he never did. Liam's colleagues would often pass by the cabin on their patrols, unable to resist the pull of its emptiness. They told themselves it was to ensure everything was secure, but in truth, they were searching for answers. They examined his gear, scoured his logs for any overlooked detail, and stared at the forest beyond the cabin's window, hoping for a sign. Each visit ended the same way, with nothing. One ranger, Sarah Green, couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was hiding something. During one of her patrols near the area where Liam's flashlight had been found, she paused, letting the eerie quiet settle over her. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows long and menacing. She thought of the strange symbols etched into the bark, the circle of undisturbed snow. Could it have been a prank? A coincidence? Or something far older and unknowable? As December waned, the park grew more desolate. A storm swept through, dropping heavy snow that buried entire trails and locked the wilderness in frozen stillness. No visitors dared venture this deep into the park, and even the rangers reduced their patrols to essential routes. Yet, amid this quiet, strange reports trickled in. An older ranger claimed to have heard footsteps crunching through the snow while patrolling one evening. When he turned, no one was there. Another mentioned finding a set of footprints leading into the trees, human by the looks of them, but they stopped abruptly, as though the person had vanished mid-step. Sarah herself awoke one night to the sound of faint tapping on her cabin window, only to find nothing but the swirling snow outside. Though none of them spoke openly of it, the rangers all felt it. The forest was alive in a way it hadn't been before. Not alive with the usual rustling of squirrels or the calls of winter birds, but with something else. Something watchful, something waiting. Liam's disappearance rippled beyond the park's boundaries. His parents, who lived 2 states away, made the drive to Sequoia, hoping to bring their son home, or, at the very least, to find closure. Their faces, weary and tear-streaked, became a familiar sight around the ranger station during the search. When the search ended, they returned to a home filled with photos of his son, who would never walk through the door again. Local newspapers speculated wildly, their headlines feeding the growing unease among the community. Ranger vanishes in Sequoia National Park, no answers, a mysterious disappearance. And Is the park hiding something? Residents whispered about the park's history, of those who had vanished in years past, of unmarked graves, of legends long buried beneath the redwood's roots. The park superintendent held a press conference, reassuring the public that every effort had been made and that Liam's disappearance was likely a tragic accident. But even he stumbled over his words when pressed about the lack of evidence, the peculiarities of the search. "Major," he said finally, "is unpredictable." As winter's grip deepened, the story of Liam Carter faded from the front pages, replaced by newer tragedies and fresher mysteries. But for those who had known him, his colleagues, his friends, his family, his absence remained a sharp, aching wound. The forest, for all its beauty, had become a place of dread. Where Liam had once walked with purpose, others now hesitated, glancing over their shoulders, unwilling to linger. Even as the snow fell, blanketing the land in pristine white, the redwoods seemed to whisper among themselves, their ancient trunks creaking with secrets they refused to share. Liam Carter was gone, but in the hearts of those who had searched for him, the forest still breathed his name, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. The snow began to retreat from the great expanse of Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks, uncovering what the winter had kept hidden. Tiny streams, fed by melting ice, snaked their way through the underbrush, and the towering redwoods stretched skyward as if welcoming the sun's warmth. Hikers were finally returning, eager to explore the wilderness that had been buried in snow for months. For a pair of experienced adventurers, the fall was an opportunity to venture into the less trodden paths. Greg and Allison, a couple who had frequented the park for years, sought out solitude in its remote corners. Their boots crunched on patches of remaining frost as they moved deeper into the park, guided by their map and an appetite for adventure. They reached an area few dared to explore, an overgrown trail that meandered into a dense patch of forest. Greg stopped suddenly, his hand raised to signal Allison to pause. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. Allison frowned, listening intently. "Hear what?" "Nothing," Greg replied. "No birds, no wind, nothing at all." The forest held an unnatural silence, the kind that presses on the ears and fills the mind with unease. But curiosity propelled them forward, the allure of discovering something unseen too tempting to resist. As they broke through a dense thicket, they stepped into a clearing. The scene before them froze them in place. There, in the center of the glade, lay a man. His body was perfectly preserved, untouched by animals or decay. He was sprawled on his back, arms at his sides, as though he had lain down to rest. His eyes, wide open, stared blankly at the canopy above, reflecting the faint blue of the sky. "Oh my God," Allison whispered, her voice trembling. Greg approached cautiously, his instincts torn between the need to help and the primal urge to flee. "Don't touch anything," he said firmly, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The man's clothing, though weathered, identified him immediately. A park ranger's uniform, the badge still intact, and a name tag that read Liam Carter. Authorities arrived swiftly after Greg and Allison reported the discovery. The rangers, the local sheriff's office, and even state investigators descended on the clearing, their faces grim as they examined the body. What struck everyone was the sheer serenity of the scene. Liam's expression wasn't one of pain or terror, but of eerie calm. His body showed no visible injuries, no signs of a struggle, no frostbite or other indications of exposure. His gear lay undisturbed beside him, his backpack neatly zipped, his water bottle full, his flashlight still operational. The most perplexing find was his notebook, tucked securely into his jacket pocket. A ranger retrieved it with gloved hands and flipped through the pages. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about the weather, trail conditions, and wildlife sightings. But the final pages were different. The handwriting grew uneven, almost frantic. The silence is louder now. It's pressing against me. Watching. The trees move when I'm not looking. They're alive. Pay now. I can't run. It's here. The last entry was barely legible, scrawled in shaky letters. It's too late. The quarter's report was as baffling as the scene itself. No trauma, no toxins, no signs of hypothermia or dehydration. It was as though Liam's body had simply stopped, his life extinguished without reason. Officially, the cause of death was labeled undetermined. News of the discovery spread quickly. Reporters descended upon the town, sensationalizing the mystery and reviving old legends about the forest's curse. Some speculated Liam had fallen victim to a rare, undiagnosed medical condition. Others whispered of the supernatural, claiming he had anchored something ancient within the park. But for those who had known Liam, his fellow rangers, his friends, and his family, the lack of answers was the most unsettling part. As the search teams packed up and left the clearing, the forest returned to its unnatural silence. The sun dipped behind the redwoods, casting long shadows that stretched like reaching fingers over the earth. Far above, nestled in the highest branches of a towering sequoia, something moved, something that didn't belong. And then it was gone, leaving behind only the faint echo of the wind. The forest was waking up. Spring's tentative warmth crept over Sequoia and Kings Canyon national parks, melting the snow and coaxing life from the frozen ground. But the discovery of Liam Carter's body shattered the fragile peace. His body had been found in a secluded glade, a place so remote and untouched that even seasoned rangers had rarely ventured there. He lay on his back, arms at his sides, his face turned toward the canopy above, as though contemplating the heavens. His expression was calm, serene, even, but something about the stillness of his form unsettled those who found him. It was the stillness of someone who had left the world not in pain, but in silent surrender. Investigators arrived quickly, their presence disrupting the glade's eerie tranquility. They moved with a mixture of urgency and unease, their voices hushed as if afraid of waking something slumbering in the woods. The body showed no visible signs of trauma, no bruises, no cuts, no frostbite. His clothes were intact, unsoiled by the elements. His boots were still laced tightly, and his coat, set to the neck, showed no evidence of a struggle. As they examined the scene, one of the detectives, a pragmatic man named Inspector Delaney, noted something peculiar. The ground beneath Liam's body was completely dry, a patch of air untouched by the melting snow that had saturated the rest of the forest floor. It was as though Liam had been placed there deliberately, in a pocket of untouched wilderness. "Is it natural?" one of the younger officers asked, his voice trembling. Delaney crouched beside the body, running a gloved hand over the soil. "Doesn't seem like it," he murmured, his brow furrowed. "But what does that even mean out here?" Among Liam's belongings was a small, weathered notebook tucked into his coat pocket. Its pages were damp but legible, being smudged in places as though hurriedly written. It was the last entries that drew the most attention, cryptic, fragmented thoughts that hinted at a descent into something beyond comprehension. "The silence is louder now. It's pressing against me. I keep seeing it, just at the edge." I turn and it's gone. The trees are moving when they shouldn't. I think it knows I'm here. I don't think it likes me. Delaney read the words aloud to the assembled team, his voice steady but grim. A chill ran through the group, though the air was warm. The implications were impossible to ignore. Liam had clearly been frightened in his final days, but frightened by what? One mind in particular stood out, circled several times in dark ink. It's not the forest. It's what lives inside the silence. The medical examiner's findings only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of hypothermia, dehydration, or malnutrition. Liam's heart had simply stopped, as though he had chosen to slip away. Toxicology reports revealed no substances in his system, no drugs, no poisons. His body was perfectly preserved, untouched by scavengers or the harsh elements of winter. It's like he just stopped being, the examiner said, shaking his head. I'd never seen anything like it. The findings were maddeningly inconclusive, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as undetermined, a sterile term that failed to capture the eerie circumstances surrounding Liam's demise. As the case made its way into public consciousness, theories flourished. Some believed Liam had succumbed to the isolation, his mind unraveling in the vast, silent wilderness. Others suggested foul play, though no evidence supported the claim. The most unsettling theories came from locals who knew the park's history. Stories of the forest, taking people back, whispers of a presence that existed beyond human understanding. One ranger, an older man who had worked in the park for decades, spoke in hushed tones about the silent watchers. He refused to elaborate, but warned the search team to tread carefully in certain areas of the park. Some places aren't meant for us, he said critically. And if you go there, you might not come back. In the weeks following Liam's discovery, the park's rangers reported strange occurrences. Radios crackled with static, even on clear days. Equipment malfunctioned inexplicably. Some claimed to hear faint voices carried by the wind. Others saw fleeting shadows between the trees. The forest, once a place of solace, had turned oppressive, its silence heady with unspoken secrets. Delaney returned to the glade one last time, standing in the spot where Liam had been found. He stared at the towering redwoods, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The detective was a man of logic and reason, but here, in this place, he felt something he couldn't explain. A presence, vast and indifferent, watching from the depths of the forest. The case was officially closed a month later. The report labeled Liam's death an unsolved mystery, leaving his family and colleagues with no answers, only questions. But for those who had been part of the investigation, the forest would never feel the same. And somewhere, deep within the woods, the silence waited. The ranger station buzzed with subdued activity. Investigators had scoured every inch of the area where Liam Carter's body was found, yet the case file remained maddeningly thin. The lack of evidence gnawed at Sheriff Gerald Tate, a man not prone to superstition, but increasingly uneasy about this particular case. When his deputy knocked on his office door with the suggestion to visit old Elias, he had scoffed at first. The hermit was well known for his eccentricity and penchant for spitting yarns about the park. Still, with nowhere else to turn, the sheriff relented. The hike to Elias Gray's cabin was arduous, the trail twisting through dense underbrush and shadowed by towering redwoods that seemed to lean closer with every step. The air was heavy, not with humidity, but with an oppressive stillness. Even the birds, which should have heralded spring, were eerily silent. By the time the sheriff and his deputy arrived, the late afternoon sun had dipped low, casting the clearing in needed gold. The cabin was a haphazard structure of salvaged wood and rusted metal sheets, leaning as though tired of standing. Smoke coiled lazily from a crooked chimney. A dog, mangy but alert, growled low as the men approached. "Elias," the sheriff called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the wiry figure of Elias Grady. His face was a roadmap of creases, his eyes sunken but sharp, glinting like a predator's in the gloom. His clothes were layers of patchwork fabric, blending into the wilderness as though he were a part of it. Well, Elias rasped, his voice gravelly from years of solitude. "Didn't expect the laws to come knocking on my door. You hear about the boy?" The sheriff exchanged a glance with his deputy before nodding. "You know something about Liam Carter?" Elias stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The cabin's interior was as chaotic as its exterior, cluttered with mismatched furniture, jars of preserved herbs, and pelts draped over every surface. The air smelled of wood smoke and something earthy, almost fungal. "Heard about it," Elias said, easing into a creaking chair. "Everyone thinks it's a mystery, but it's not." The sheriff leaned forward, his skepticism thinly veiled. "And you know what happened?" Elias chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The forest happened." The hermit's words came haltingly at first, as though he were reluctant to speak. But once he started, the story spilled out, winding and cryptic like the park's trails. "This land ain't just trees and dirt," Elias began, his voice low and deliberate. "It's alive. Not like plants and animals alive, something older. Something that don't take kindly to being disturbed." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "You're saying the forest killed him?" "Not the forest itself," Elias said, his eyes narrowing. "But there's things in it. Spirits, maybe. Call 'em what you will. I've seen him, sheriff. Felt him. They don't like when people wander too deep where they're not welcome." The deputy, younger and less patient, snorted. "You're talking about ghost stories, old man." Elias's gaze snapped to him, hard as granite. "You think I'm making this up? I've lived out here longer than you've been alive, boy. I've seen folks vanish without a trace. Seen their faces in the trees after. Heard their voices on the wind, calling for help. They ain't the same after the forest takes them." The room seemed colder now, though the fire still crackled in the hearth. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You expect me to believe that Liam Carter, what, offended some forest spirit and paid the price?" Elias leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't care what you believe. I'm telling you the truth. That boy, he saw something he shouldn't have. Something that saw him back." The sheriff opened his mouth to press further, but Elias cut him off. "There's a place," the hermit said, his gaze distant, "deep in the forest, where the air don't move and the sun don't reach. I seen it once years ago. Found it. I stayed away after that, but not everyone's that smart." The sheriff's stomach churned. The place Elias described matched the area where Liam's body had been found. "Why didn't whatever it is take you?" the deputy asked, his tone laced with sarcasm. Elias grinned, baring yellow teeth. "Maybe you don't like the taste of me. Or maybe I respect it enough to leave it be." As the men left the cabin, the sky darkened into twilight, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The sheriff tried to dismiss Elias's story as the ramblings of an old man gone feral, but the unease clung to him. The hermit's final words echoed in his mind. Don't go back there, Sheriff. You won't like what finds you. By the time they reached the trailhead, the wind had picked up, whispering through the trees like voices just out of earshot. The park's reopening after Liam Carter's disappearance was supposed to bring a return to normalcy, but normalcy proved elusive. Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park seemed unwilling to let go of their secrets. Rangers reported strange occurrences, things that defied explanation and made the park feel less like a sanctuary and more like a living, breathing entity that was watching them. The first to notice was Julie Nash, a seasoned ranger with 15 years of experience. She was patrolling the area near the creek where Liam had been last seen, the same creek where his flashlight had been found, its bulb flickering faintly as if protesting its abandonment. The air was crisp and still, save for the faint murmur of running water beneath a thin sheet of ice. But then came the whispers. At first, Julie thought it was the wind, funneling through the ancient redwoods in some peculiar way. Yet, as she stood still, listening, she could discern faint words in the wind's current. They weren't in English, or if they were distorted to the point of unrecognizability. They rose and fell like a broken melody, teasing her ears before vanishing altogether. "How long?" Julie called out, her voice sharp against the cold air. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence that followed. Her hand instinctively moved to the radio clipped to her vest, but static greeted her when she attempted to contact the station. The equipment had been checked earlier that morning. There was no reason for it to fail. As she turned to head back to her vehicle, her boots slipped slightly, and she glanced down to find herself standing in another of those perfect snow circles, the same kind that had been discovered during Liam's search. The snow within the circle was oddly warm to the touch, as though it had been sunlit, even in the overcast afternoon. Julie stepped out of it quickly, her pulse quickening. She didn't report it immediately. She didn't want to sound hysterical. The following weeks brought more reports. Ranger Paul Delaney, a skeptic at heart, began his patrol near the old Hermit Trail, a seldom used path long overshadowed by more popular routes. As he walked, his GPS device began to malfunction, the screen flashing erratic coordinates. Frustrated, he tapped at the device before stowing it away and relying on his map instead. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the distance, half concealed by a cluster of redwoods. At first, he assumed it was a hiker, though the park was nearly empty that day. "Hey, you okay?" Paul called, but the figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It stood unnaturally still, as though carved from stone. Paul approached cautiously, but as he neared, the figure dissolved into a shadow cast by the swaying branches. It wasn't until he reached the spot where it had stood that he realized the ground beneath his feet was completely barren. No leaves, no snow, no sign anyone had been there. The reports piled up. Rangers spoke of their radios crackling to life with faint voices, sometimes a child's laugh, sometimes a low, guttural groan. Footsteps echoed behind them on solitary trails, but when they turned, no one was there. Trees that had stood for centuries suddenly bore fresh scars, deep gashes that looked too deliberate to be caused by animals. Compasses spun wildly, refusing to align, as though the forest itself had decided to rewrite the rules. Rumors spread among the staff. Some blamed the strange occurrences on Liam's death. "He disturbed something," Julie whispered to Paul one evening at the station, her eyes darting toward the window, as though expecting to see the same shadowy figure she had encountered weeks ago. "You know the stories. The old ones. They say the forest has a will of its own." Paul scoffed, but his laughter rang hollow. He hadn't told anyone about the figure he'd seen or the way his nights were plagued with dreams of the forest. Dreams where he was running, always running, but never able to escape. Other rangers dismissed the tales as paranoia, the product of grief and overwrought imaginations. But even they began to avoid certain parts of the park, whispering superstitiously about cursed zones and bad trails. The forest seemed darker than usual, its shadows stretching longer, its silence heavier. One night, during a rare gathering at the manger station, someone brought up the old hermit who lived at the park's edge. "He's been out here longer than any of us," said Pete, the oldest ranger on staff. "If anyone knows what's going on, it's him." The hermit's name was Amos, though few knew much about him. He was a reclusive figure who lived in a rundown cabin far from any trail. Rangers only crossed paths with him occasionally, usually when he needed supplies. "He's harmless," Pete had always assured them. But now, harmless didn't seem reassuring enough. Julie and Paul volunteered to visit Amos the next day. When they reached his cabin, Amos greeted them with his usual stoic demeanor, though his eyes lingered on them a moment too long. "You felt it, haven't you?" Amos said before they could explain the purpose of their visit. His voice was deep and weathered, like the bark of the trees. "The forest, it's awake now." "What do you mean?" Julie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amos leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "There's a balance here, always has been. But something shifted. That boy," he paused, his expression darkening. "He saw something he wasn't meant to see. The forest doesn't forget." The rangers left Amos's cabin more unsettled than ever. His cryptic words offered no answers, only more questions. But as they drove back through the winding roads of the park, neither could shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by a person, but by the forest itself. And deep within the woods, the whispers began again. The sky above Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks was a bruised shade of gray as spring rain threatened to spill over the treetops. Months had passed since Liam Carter's disappearance, and the forest, as it always did, began to reclaim the spaces left untended by human hands. Yet, for those who knew Liam, his colleagues, his friends, and the small, tight-knit ranger community, time had done little to dull the ache of his loss. They gathered at the edge of the creek, a small group of rangers dressed in their green uniforms, boots muddy from the thawing ground. A makeshift memorial stood where Liam's flashlight had been found, a simple plaque fastened to a post, bearing his name, the dates of his life, and the words "forever protecting the wild." Around it, someone had placed a few stones in a careful circle, their surfaces damp and dark from the drizzle. Sarah Peters, the ranger who had worked alongside Liam the most, stood at the forefront of the group. She held a single white flower in her hand, her fingers trembling as though the chill of the morning had seeped into her bones. Liam had been more than a colleague to her. He had been a friend, almost like a younger brother, full of life and enthusiasm, a spark of warmth in the often cold and lonely park service. She placed the flower at the base of the memorial, her voice steady but hollow as she spoke. "Liam loved this place. He said it made him feel small in the best way, like he was part of something bigger. I hope wherever he is, he's at peace." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortably final. The other rangers nodded solemnly, but none of them could meet each other's eyes. Each one carried the weight of unanswered questions, their minds circling the same gnawing doubts. Liam's death hadn't been natural, at least not in the way they understood nature, but no one dared to say it aloud. The official report had been maddeningly inconclusive. The coroner had ruled out hypothermia, trauma, or foul play. The park authorities had categorized Liam's death as exposure-related, a catch-all term that satisfied bureaucratic boxes but left the rangers haunted. Then there was the notebook. Sarah hadn't been able to bring herself to look at the entries again, but she remembered them too vividly to need the pages in front of her. Liam had written about the silence as if it were a living thing. He had described the feeling of being watched, the faint sounds of voices that he could never quite place. The final entry had chilled her to the core. It knows I'm here. I think it's waiting. She shook the memory from her mind, turning her attention back to the present. The memorial ceremony was over now, the other rangers dispersing slowly, their boots crunching against the wet ground. Sarah stayed behind, her gaze fixed on the creek where Liam's flashlight had been found, the same spot where the search party had discovered the strange footprints that led to nowhere. A breeze swept through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. It felt colder than it should have been for spring, and Sarah shivered. She swore she could hear something faint, like a whisper, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there but the towering redwoods and the empty forest. As the months went on, life in the park resumed its usual rhythm. Hikers returned, the campgrounds reopened, and the staff, out of necessity, moved forward. But a shadow lingered over the park. Visitors began reporting odd occurrences, strange sounds at night, flickering lights in the forest, and an unsettling sense of being followed. Rangers who patrolled the area near Liam's last known location spoke of equipment malfunctions, radios cutting to static, flashlights flickering despite fresh batteries. One ranger, new to the team, claimed to have seen a figure standing among the trees late one evening. It looked like a man, he told Sarah, his voice shaky, but not solid, like a shadow with edges. Sarah dismissed it outwardly, but the knot in her stomach tightened. She remembered the shadowy shapes Liam had described in his notebook. Late one evening, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She sat in the ranger station, a mug of coffee cooling in her hands, and stared at the framed photo on the wall. It was a picture of the ranger team from last summer, before Liam's disappearance. He stood in the middle of the group, grinning brightly, his arms slung around Sarah's shoulder. "What happened to you?" she whispered aloud, her voice breaking. The forest outside seemed to answer with its silence, oppressive and unrelenting. Though no one said it aloud, there was an unspoken agreement among the rangers. No one wanted to patrol the area where Liam had been found. The forest there felt different now, heavier somehow, as though it held its breath. Even the visitors sensed it, often cutting their hike short and hurrying back to the trails. The park superintendent eventually closed off that section, citing safety concerns due to unstable terrain. But the rangers knew better. They knew that whatever had happened to Liam, the forest would not forget. In the quiet hours of the night, Sarah often thought about that final entry in Liam's notebook. It's waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know. But as she looked out into the shadowed forest, she felt the weight of its gaze, and she knew that some questions were never meant to be answered. The forest was a cathedral of stillness, its towering redwoods reaching skyward like ancient pillars holding up the pale gray sky. Snow, untouched and pristine, blanketed the ground, muffling the world in an oppressive quiet. Ranger Daniel Brooks, newly assigned to the Sequoia National Park team, stepped cautiously through the frost-bitten undergrowth. He was acutely aware of the weight of history that lingered in these woods. The unresolved disappearance of Liam Carter, a name whispered with reverence and fear among his new colleagues. The faint crunch of Daniel's boots against the icy ground was the only sound, save for the occasional groan of the trees in the wind. His radio crackled softly at his side, tuned to the station's channel but eerily devoid of chatter. He paused at a familiar landmark, a crooked redwood that seemed to twist unnaturally against the skyline. It was the same tree where Liam Carter's flashlight had been found months before. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he spotted something unusual in the snow. Footprints. The tracks were faint, as though the snow had only half remembered the weight that pressed into it. They were human, no doubt, but uneven, like someone dragging a foot. They led away from the creek and into a part of the forest no one spoke of willingly. Against his better judgment, Daniel followed. The deeper he ventured, the more the air seemed to change. It grew colder, but not in the natural way of winter's chill. This was something else, an unnatural cold that gnawed at his senses, making the hairs on his arms stand despite his insulated jacket. The silence pressed against him, so thick and profound it felt like a living thing. His radio hissed softly, then went dead. He stopped and tapped it nervously, but no static, no voices, nothing broke through the void. "Is anyone there?" he called out, his voice trembling. It didn't echo. It was swallowed whole by the forest. The tracks led to a clearing, a space where the snow seemed unnaturally smooth, untouched by falling branches or scurrying animals. At the center of the clearing was a patch of bare earth, its stark contrast to the snow around it unnerving. Daniel's heart thudded against his ribs as he stepped closer. The clearing smelled wrong, a faint metallic tang, like blood, mingled with the damp, earthy aroma of the woods. Then he sighed. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. It was tall and still, blending so seamlessly with the trunks around it that Daniel had to blink to confirm it wasn't just a trick of the light. His breath hitched, forming a cloud in the freezing air. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, but it was watching. He could feel its gaze, a sensation like icy needles pricking the back of his neck. "Who's there?" Daniel called out, his voice wavering. No response. He took a tentative step forward, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight strapped to his belt. The beam cut through the gloom, landing squarely on the figure. But it wasn't there. Where the light fell, there was nothing but trees. He swept the beam back and forth, his pulse racing. A noise behind him, soft, like the whisper of a footstep, made him spin around. The figure was closer now, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Daniel's flashlight flickered and died. Panic surged in his chest as he fumbled with the radio, his gloves making the task impossible. "This is Ranger Brooks," he shouted into the silent device. "I need assistance. Someone." His words died in his throat. The figure began to move, not with the slow, deliberate steps of a human, but with a gliding, unnatural motion, as though the forest itself carried it forward. It came closer, and with every inch it gained, the air seemed to grow heavier. Daniel stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root hidden beneath the snow. He fell hard, the cold seeping into his bones. "Stay back," he shouted, but the words were swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figure stopped at the edge of the bare earth, tilting its head as if studying him. For a brief, horrifying moment, Daniel thought he saw eyes, two pinpoints of light that burned like distant stars. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving only the sound of the wind stirring the trees. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his breath ragged and his mind racing. The footprints he'd followed were gone, erased as though they'd never existed. He turned and ran, the forest seeming to close in around him as he retraced his path. The towering redwoods no longer felt like guardians, but like silent witnesses, their gnarled branches reaching down to pull him back. When Daniel finally broke through the tree line and reached the ranger station, he collapsed against the door, gasping for air. His colleagues found him there minutes later, his face pale and his hands trembling. "What happened?" one of them asked, alarmed. Daniel could only shake his head, his mind unable to form the words. In the distance, the wind carried a sound that could have been the creak of the trees or a whisper. And deep within the forest, the clearing remained untouched, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon it. The sun dipped behind the towering granite cliffs of Yosemite National Park, casting long, jagged shadows across the valley floor. The air was crisp, filled with the damp scent of pine and earth, but there was an unsettling stillness to the evening. Logan Mitchell adjusted the brim of his ranger hat and scanned the horizon. His boots crunched softly on the gravel path as he moved deeper into the park. It was his favorite time of day, when the tourists had packed up their picnics and the wilderness reclaimed its solitude. Tonight, however, felt different. Logan paused by a bend in the trail, resting his hand on the cool metal of his flashlight clipped to his belt. The birds had gone silent, leaving the faint rustling of leaves as the only sound. A low mist crept along the ground, swirling around the bases of the ancient sequoias like restless spirits. He keyed the button on his handheld radio. "Mitchell checking in. I'm about 2 miles west of Sentinel Dome. Everything's quiet out here." His voice carried a calm, practiced cadence, but the static-laced reply he received made him frown. "Copy that, Mitchell. Keep an eye out. There's a weather system rolling in tonight. Might get foggy." The voice of his colleague, Sarah Grayson, was familiar, steady. It was comforting, but even her reassurances didn't dispel the unease creeping up Logan's spine. "I'll check in again in 30, Logan said, releasing the button with a sharp click. He slid the radio back into its holster and continued along the trail. His steps grew slower as the mist thickened, dulling the outlines of the trees and turning the world into a muted palette of gray and green. The sun was gone now, and the forest seemed to close in around him. The unmarked trail appeared suddenly, as if conjured from the fog itself. Logan stopped, his brow furrowing. He'd walked this route dozens of times before, and never noticed a branching path. It was narrow, framed by dense underbrush that seemed to lean inward, forming a tunnel of shadow. He reached for his flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom, revealing a faint depression in the earth, evidence of footprints, though they were indistinct and fading. Logan hesitated. Protocol dictated he report any unmarked trails or unusual features, but something about the path called to him, an inexplicable pull that he couldn't shake. He keyed his radio again. "Grayson, Mitchell here. Found an unmarked trail about 2 miles west of Sentinel Dome. Going to check it out." Static crackled in reply, followed by a distorted voice. "Copy. Be careful. Disability." The signal cut out abruptly. Logan tapped the side of the radio, frowning, but no further response came. He glanced back the way he'd come, the main trail now swallowed by fog. A sense of isolation settled over him like a heavy cloak. "All right then," he muttered, stepping onto the unmarked trail. The ground beneath his boots was softer here, damp with dew and littered with fallen leaves. The forest grew denser, the sequoias towering overhead like silent sentinels. Logan's flashlight beam danced across the trees, illuminating bark that seemed unusually dark, almost charred in places. A cold breeze swept past him, carrying with it the faintest hint of something metallic, iron, perhaps, or blood. The further he walked, the stranger the trail became. Branches arched over the path, twisting together like clawed hands, forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Loden's breathing quickened, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but the pull of the trail was undeniable. It wasn't long before he noticed something else: the absence of sound. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, nothing but the faint crunch of his boots on the damp earth. He stopped abruptly, his flashlight trained on a cluster of rocks ahead. There was something etched into their surface, faint and weathered, but undeniably deliberate. Symbols. "What the hell is this?" Loden muttered, crouching to examine the markings. They weren't in any language he recognized, jagged, looping lines that seemed to shift under the beam of his flashlight. He reached out to touch one, but a sudden rustle behind him made him spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife on his belt. The path behind him was empty, the fog curling like a living thing. "Calon?" he called out, his voice firm but tinged with unease. It echoed faintly, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive stillness. There was no reply. Loden straightened, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but something about this place, this trail, felt wrong. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, leaving the strange symbols behind. The fog grew thicker still, and the trail narrowed until it felt as though the forest itself was trying to swallow him whole. Loden kept moving, his flashlight beam flickering slightly, his mind racing with questions. Where did this trail lead? Why had he never noticed it before? And why did it feel like the trees were watching him? Somewhere in the distance, faint and almost imperceptible, he thought he heard his name. "Mitchell." He froze, the flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. His name echoed again, soft and hollow, like the whisper of a breeze. And then silence. Loden stood there for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold, damp air. He was a seasoned ranger, accustomed to the quirks of the wilderness, but this was something different. He swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline, and forced himself to move forward, deeper into the unknown. Behind him, the forest closed in, erasing the trail as though it had never existed. The air was thick with a damp chill as Loden Mitchell eased his boots along the unmarked trail. The path hadn't been there yesterday. He was certain of it. The ground bore no sign of heavy foot traffic, no traces of hikers, no familiar scuff marks from boots or trekking poles. Yet the trail seemed deliberate, as if it had always existed, hidden in plain sight until now. Loden's hand brushed against the rough bark of a pine tree as he paused to inspect his surroundings. The towering evergreens seemed denser here, their spindly branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. A faint breeze passed through the forest, but it wasn't the comforting whisper of nature he had come to know. This was different, sharper, carrying with it a strange undertone, almost like a voice, low and indistinct, carried just beyond the edge of comprehension. He radioed into the station. "Station 7, this is Ranger Mitchell," he said, his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. "I'm on an unmarked trail, east of Lost Arrows. For path looks unusual, but no immediate signs of danger. I'll investigate further." Static greeted him, the kind of static that seemed alive, writhing and crackling, almost forming words. He frowned and adjusted the dial, but the interference only grew worse. "Station 7 copy?" He tried again. The static surged, then cut off entirely, leaving only an oppressive silence. It wasn't the first time his equipment had failed in the park's deeper sections, but this felt different. The silence pressed against him, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Logan pressed onward, his boots crunching softly against the earth. The trail wound deeper into the woods, narrowing with each step. The underbrush thickened, but he noticed something odd. No animals scurried away from his approach. No birds called out overhead. Even the usual rustling of unseen critters was absent. It was as if the entire forest had emptied itself, leaving only Logan and the path. The fog clung low to the ground now, curling around his legs like tendrils. His steps faltered as he spotted something unusual ahead. A tree, massive and ancient, its bark deeply gouged with what appeared to be markings. He approached cautiously, his gloved fingers brushing the grooves. The patterns were intricate, almost deliberate, yet entirely foreign. Swirling shapes formed no language he recognized, but they carried a strange symmetry that unsettled him. Logan took out his notebook, sketching the markings as best he could. His hand shook slightly, a tremor he quickly dismissed as the chill in the air. As he worked, the forest seemed to close in tighter, the trees leaning ever so slightly, their branches forming a dark canopy above. The trail curved sharply ahead, disappearing into the fog. He hesitated, glancing back the way he'd come. It was barely visible now, a faint outline swallowed by the shadows of the forest. The logical part of him urged caution, mark his path, and turn back. But a deeper instinct, one he couldn't quite explain, pulled him forward. Rounding the curve, Logan froze. In the center of the trail, partially obscured by the mist, lay an object, a lone flashlight. It was upright, its beam still glowing weakly, casting a thin, pale cone of light into the surrounding fog. Logan crouched down, inspecting it without touching. The flashlight was old, its casing scratched and tarnished. He noticed specks of dried mud along its handle, but what struck him most was the eerie stillness around it. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints leading to or from its location. It simply sat there, as if placed intentionally. His breath clouded in the air as he reached for his own flashlight, comparing the two. The design was similar, but this one was dated, almost antiquated, like something from decades past. He reached for his radio again, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. "Station 7, this is Mitchell. I found something. A flashlight. Seems out of place. No other signs yet, but..." The static returned, harsher now, almost vibrating in his ears. Beneath it, faintly, he thought he heard something else. A whisper. "Mitchell." The voice rasped through the static. Logan's blood ran cold. It wasn't his colleagues. The voice was distorted, unrecognizable, and far too close. He swung his flashlight around, illuminating the surrounding trees, but nothing stirred. He swallowed hard and stepped back onto the trail, suddenly aware of how alone he was. The fog seemed to thicken with every breath he took, coiling tighter around him. The path ahead stretched into the shadows, twisting and vanishing into the forest's depths. Logan's fingers tightened around his flashlight. Whatever lay ahead, he had no choice but to follow. The air grew colder as Logan Mitchell ventured further down the unmarked trail, his breath condensing into faint wisps that dissolved into the dense fog. The towering trees, their bark gnarled and blackened in the fading light, leaned in as if to form a silent, oppressive tunnel. The trail was unlike anything he'd encountered in his years as a ranger. It seemed alive, its path winding with an unnatural fluidity that defied the logic of the park's terrain. Logan paused, kneeling to examine a patch of disturbed soil. The footprints were shallow, mismatched, and pointed in various directions, as though someone had been spinning in place. Strange, he muttered under his breath, his voice muffled by the thick air. Straightening up, he adjusted his pack and pressed on, the crunch of his boots against the dirt trail the only sound in the oppressive silence. But then, it wasn't silent anymore. The sound came softly at first, a faint rustling among the branches overhead. Logan stopped, his hand instinctively brushing the grit of his utility knife. His eyes scanned the canopy, searching for the source. "Squirrels, matey," he said aloud, his voice meant to reassure himself as much as to fill the empty void. But there were no squirrels, no birds, not even the faint hum of insects that typically inhabited the forest. The rustling stopped abruptly, replaced by something else, a whisper. Logan's body tensed. He turned slowly, ears straining to identify the sound. It wasn't the wind. The whisper carried a cadence, a fragmented rhythm like words spoken in a language just beyond comprehension. It floated from nowhere and everywhere, weaving itself into the fog around him. "How long?" Logan called out, his voice firm but edged with uncertainty. The whisper ceased. The silence that followed was heavier, charged with an unnatural weight that pressed against his chest. The trail twisted sharply to the left, leading him into a grove of ancient sequoias. Their massive trunks loomed like silent sentinels, their bark scarred with deep, jagged grooves. Logan crouched to examine one of the markings, running his fingers over its surface. The cuts were deliberate, carved with precision. Symbols, patterns. They meant nothing to him, yet they stirred a strange unease in his gut. A twig snapped behind him. Logan whirled around, flashlight in hand, its beam cutting through the fog like a knife. "Who's there?" he demanded. His voice carried through the forest, but received no reply. He swept the light in a slow arc, its glow revealing nothing but trees and shadows. "Probably just an animal," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. His pulse quickened as he realized the trail he'd been following had vanished behind him. The ground, once marked with his footprints, now appeared undisturbed, as if he had never been there at all. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him like a phantom chorus. His name emerged from the cacophony, faint and distorted. "Blood again." The sound was impossibly distant yet chillingly close, as though it were being spoken directly into his ear. Logan spun again, clutching his flashlight like a weapon, but the light revealed nothing. "Stop it!" he barked, his voice cracking. The whispers fell silent once more, replaced by an even more unsettling sound, the echo of his own voice, distorted and stretched, as though the forest itself was mocking him. He backed away instinctively, his boots scraping against the forest floor. His mind raced to find a rational explanation, but every quarter of his reasoning hit a wall. Was he hallucinating? Had he eaten something spoiled? No, he thought. This is real. The oppressive quiet returned, but it felt different now. It wasn't just silence, it was the absence of life. The forest, once familiar and full of energy, now felt dead. No, not dead. Watching. Logan's breathing quickened as he scanned the surroundings, every nerve in his body on edge. He needed to move, to find his way back to the marked trails. His hand went to his radio, but the static that greeted him wasn't normal. It wasn't random. It had a pattern. Faintly, beneath the crackle, he thought he heard more whispers, layered and overlapping, as if voices were speaking just beyond his understanding. "Look again." The voice came again, this time unmistakably clear, and it was his own voice. Lovin's grip on the flashlight tightened as his hands trembled. For the first time in years, he felt truly afraid. He had always believed the wilderness was something to be respected but never feared. Now, standing in the heart of Yosemite's most remote reaches, he wasn't so sure. He turned back toward the way he thought he'd come, determined to retrace his steps. But as he moved, the whispers seemed to follow, keeping just out of reach. Every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of his vision felt alive, sentient. And then, faintly, he heard something worse than the whispers. The sound of footsteps. They didn't belong to him. The ranger station sat nestled in a cradle of pines, the sturdy wooden building normally a place of safety and command for Yosemite's keepers. Tonight, it felt different. The fog outside pressed against the windows, distorting the glow of the exterior lights. Inside, the air was tense, tinged with a quiet urgency that hinted at an unease growing among the rangers. Chief Ranger Alan Trent leaned over the crackling radio set, his weathered hands adjusting the dials with a growing impatience. Static hiss from the speakers, interspersed with faint, fragmented echoes, just enough to make him pause, but not enough to comprehend. Logan Mitchell had missed his scheduled check-in nearly 2 hours ago, an anomaly for the diligent ranger. "He's probably just in a dead zone," offered Dana Reeves, a younger ranger stationed at the far desk. She tapped a pencil rhythmically against a clipboard, her voice betraying a flicker of nervousness despite her attempt to sound casual. "You know how the reception gets out there?" Alan didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the static, his brow furrowed. Logan wasn't the kind to miss check-ins, and the route he'd been patrolling didn't have a history of dead zones, at least none this persistent. "Maybe," Alan muttered, though the word felt hollow. He reached for the microphone again, his voice calm but firm as he tried one more time. "Ranger Mitchell, this is the station. Do you copy?" "Over." The silence that followed was heady, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Across the room, Dana exchanged a glance with Parker, a burly ranger known for his unflappable demeanor. "He's fine," Parker grunted, though even he sounded less certain now. "Guy probably got distracted by some lost hiker or a bear sighting." "It's Logan, for God's sake. He knows the terrain better than anyone." Alan straightened, his decision made. Distracted or not, we're not waiting around. He grabbed the logbook and scribbled something down before turning to the team. "Dana, Parker, you're coming with me. Get your gear. We head out in 10. The Rangers moved quickly, slipping into their search and rescue routines with the precision of seasoned professionals. But the unease lingered, unspoken but palpable. The fog had a way of making everything feel closer, smaller, as if the station itself might be swallowed by the encroaching white shroud. 10 minutes later, the team was loaded into the station's weathered jeep, its headlights slicing through the thick mist. The road to Loden's last known location was a twisting, narrow path that seemed more sinister under the weight of the night. The towering trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out to the edges of the road. Dana broke the silence, her voice quieter than usual. "You think it's anything unusual?" Alan shot her a glance in the rearview mirror. "Unusual how?" "I don't know." She hesitated. "Just, we've heard the stories about the disappearances. The ones they never really explained." Parker snorted, though it lacked conviction. Those are just campfire tales. Logan's probably cursing us for interrupting his quiet night out there. But Dana's words hung in the air, feeding the tension that no one wanted to acknowledge. The station's archives held accounts of rangers and hikers who had vanished into Yosemite's vast expanse, their fates forever unknown. The wilderness was unforgiving, yes, but some cases defied simple explanation. They reached Logan's patrol vehicle 20 minutes later. The truck was parked neatly at the edge of a trailhead, its headlights off and the doors locked. Alan's flashlight beam swept over the vehicle, illuminating the dust-free surfaces that suggested it had been untouched since Logan had left it. No sign of struggle, Alan said, his voice low as he opened the door and checked the interior. The keys were gone, and Logan's pack was missing, as expected. He took his gear with him. Parker turned toward the trail, shining his own might into the foggy void ahead. He went that way. Dana shivered, though the air wasn't cold. He said something about an unmarked trail, didn't he? Radioed in before the static started. Alan nodded. That's what worries me. He knows better than to go off-trail without backup. The team began their search, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they moved in formation. The forest seemed unnaturally still, their boots crunching against the dirt, and leaves the only sound. Occasionally Dana would call Logan's name, her voice swallowed almost instantly by the thick, oppressive silence. Then they found it. A flashlight, its beam still glowing faintly, stood upright in the middle of the trail. It was balanced precariously on its end, as if deliberately placed. Alan crouched down, his brow furrowing as he examined it. It is, he confirmed, recognizing the scratches on the casing. But there was no sign of Logan. Why would he leave it like this? Dana whispered, her voice barely audible. Parker scanned the surrounding forest, his expression grim. It's like he wanted us to find it. Alan stood, his jaw tightening. Or something else wanted us to. For the first time, the rangers felt the weight of the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was a suffocating absence of sound, as if the forest itself was listening. We keep moving, Alan said, his tone clicked. Stay close. No one goes off alone. And so they ventured deeper, their flashlights casting fleeting glimmers of light onto the trail ahead, unaware of the horrors that awaited them in the shadows. The search party assembled at dawn, the light breaking over Yosemite's rugged cliffs in hazy shades of gold. The park rangers, clad in their green uniforms and weighed down with equipment, exchanged grim looks. Logan Mitchell wasn't the type to vanish without a trace. Something felt off, though none dared to voice it. Leading the search was Sarah Coleman, Logan's closest friend and colleague. She was methodical, a calm voice of reason in even the tensest situations. As they split into groups, she clutched a hand-drawn map of Logan's last known location. It had been hours since his last radio call, and static was all that answered when they tried to reach him. The first leg of the trail was uneventful, almost serene. The team trudged through dense woods, their boots crunching against pine needles. Birds chirped overhead, the occasional squirrel darting through the trees. It was easy to believe, for a moment, that Logan had simply lost his way or suffered a minor injury. But then they came upon the vehicle. Logan's patrol truck sat parked at the edge of a trailhead, its doors locked, keys inside. Nothing about it appeared unusual until Sarah noticed the passenger side mirror. A streak of dirt smeared across it, like someone had brushed their hand over it hastily, leaving faint finger marks. Logan was meticulous. He wouldn't leave his truck in such a state. It was the first red flag, subtle but significant. "Looks like he went on foot from here," one ranger muttered. Sarah nodded, scanning the immediate area. "Let's follow his usual patrol route. Stay sharp." As they ventured further, the air began to shift. The forest seemed darker, denser, even though the sun still hung high. The trees here were older, their gnarled roots twisting like skeletal fingers. A faint mist clung to the ground, curling around their boots as they walked. The birdsong had stopped entirely. "Hey," one of the younger rangers, Tim, called out. "Up ahead. Do you see that?" They followed his pointing finger to a spot a few yards ahead. A faint, steady beam of light pierced the mist, standing out starkly against the forest gloom. Sarah's heart quickened as she approached. It was a flashlight, standing upright, its beam casting an unnatural brightness in the murk. She knelt to inspect it. "It is," she said, her voice tight. "Lovin's." The flashlight was spotless, as though it had been carefully placed there. Yet the ground around it showed no signs of a struggle, no footprints except their own. Sarah flicked it off and turned it over in her hands. The battery pack was warm, as though it had been recently used, but Loden was nowhere to be seen. "What the hell?" muttered Tim, stepping closer. "Why would he leave it like this?" Nobody answered. A knot of unease twisted in Sarah's stomach. She scanned the area again, this time more carefully. The trees seemed to press in closer, their shadows pulling unnaturally despite the daylight. A sudden chill swept through the group, as if a hidden draft had passed between them. "Spread out," Sarah ordered. "Look for anything, footprints, equipment, anything that tells us where you went." The rangers fanned out, their movements cautious. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf seemed louder than it should have. Sarah remained by the flashlight, running her fingers over its smooth surface. It felt wrong, as though it didn't belong here, despite being unmistakably Logan's. "Over here," another ranger shouted, breaking the silence. The group converged on the new find, a single boot print, faint but fresh, embedded in the damp earth. It was heading deeper into the forest, toward an area rarely patrolled. Sarah stared at it, her mind racing. It was the first tangible sign of Logan since he'd vanished. But something about it felt off. The print was deep, as though he'd been running, yet there was no second print, no indication of a stride. Just the one solitary mark. "What do you think?" Tim asked, his voice tinged with unease. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know, but we keep going." As they resumed their search, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The light grew dimmer, the mist thicker. Each step felt heavier, the air colder. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though every glance over her shoulder revealed nothing but trees. The flashlight's beam, now extinguished, remained in her pocket, a grim reminder of Logan's absence. She didn't know if they were closing in on him or being led into something far worse. But she couldn't shake the sensation that whatever had happened to Logan was far from ordinary. And as they pressed on, a voice whispered in the back of her mind, a voice she swore wasn't her own. "Turn back before it's too late." The forest had a way of playing tricks on the senses. At least, that's what they told themselves. Ranger Anna Hardman led the search team deeper into the fog-heavy woods, her boots crunching against the uneven ground. A seasoned ranger herself, she'd patrolled Yosemite's trails for nearly a decade, but something about this search felt different. Wrong even. The air was thick, stifling, as though the forest had been holding its breath since Logan vanished. Behind her, The team followed in strained silence, their flashlights casting long, wavering beams through the gloom. The search had started normally enough, combing the familiar trails, calling Logan's name, and scanning for any sign of him. But as they ventured further along the unmarked path he reported, the atmosphere began to shift. "Over here," one of the rangers called out. His voice, sharp and tense, cut through the quiet. Anna hurried to his side. He stood in front of a tree, a massive, ancient pine, its trunk wide enough to swallow 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Carved into its bark were strange, looping symbols. They spiraled outward in a pattern that was almost hypnotic, each line deeply etched and precise, as though made with tools far sharper than any knife. "Did he do this?" another ranger asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Anna shook her head. "No way. Logan's good, but not this good. And he wouldn't waste time carving trees during a patrol." She reached out, brushing her fingertips against the marks. The grooves felt unnervingly smooth, as if they'd been there for years. "What do they mean?" someone whispered. No one answered. The symbols defied logic, their design both ancient and unsettlingly deliberate. They seemed to hum with an energy Anna couldn't name, something just on the edge of her understanding. "Mark it and move on," Anna said, though her voice lacked its usual firmness. She didn't want to linger here any longer than necessary. As they pressed forward, the symbols became more frequent, appearing on tree after tree. They varied in size and complexity, some small enough to fit in a palm, others sprawling across entire trunks. The deeper they went, the more intricate the designs became. Some seemed to depict shapes, circles, spirals, even crude outlines of figures. Others looked like language, though not one anyone in the group could recognize. "Does this feel like a trail to anyone else?" another ranger said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Anna knew what he meant. The carvings were random. They formed a path, one that seemed to draw them further and further away from anything familiar. Hours passed, or so it seemed. Time felt distorted in the depths of the forest. The sunlight that had peeked through the canopy earlier was gone, replaced by an oppressive dimness. Their radios crackled sporadically, spitting out static and distorted fragments of voices that didn't belong to anyone on their frequency. "Hold up," Anna said, raising a hand. The group stopped, their breathing loud in the silence. Ahead, just off the trail, they found Logan's radio. It lay on the ground, its casing scratched but otherwise intact. Static hissed from its speaker, and in between the white noise, faint sounds emerged, soft, rhythmic murmurs, like someone speaking just below the range of understanding. Anna crouched beside it, her heart pounding. "Logan?" she said into her own radio, hoping against reason that he'd answer. The static didn't change. The murmurs continued, almost melodic in their cadence. "What the hell is that?" one of the rangers muttered. Anna shook her head, unwilling to speculate. "Tag it," she said, standing. "We'll analyze it back at the station." But as they continued deeper, the forest seemed to close in around them. The symbols grew stranger, more chaotic, and the once clear trail dissolved into a tangled mess of undergrowth and brambles. Yet there was no doubt in Anna's mind. They were being led somewhere. By what or for what purpose, she couldn't say. And then they found the clearing. The first thing Anna noticed was the silence. Not the natural quiet of a forest, filled with the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call, but a silence so complete it pressed against her ears, almost painful in its intensity. The clearing itself was dominated by a massive tree stump, its surface polished smooth and etched with symbols even more intricate than those on the trees. Around it, the ground was littered with fragments of bark and stone, arranged in patterns too precise to be accidental. Anna's flashlight wavered as her hand shook. She felt it then, that overwhelming sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck rose, and an icy dread curled in her stomach. "Logan?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The only response was the static from Logan's radio, still murmuring its strange, incomprehensible song. They didn't stay long after that. No one said it outright, but an unspoken agreement passed through the group. They needed to leave. As they retraced their steps, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Or worse, that the forest itself was guiding them back, as though granting them permission to leave. For now. When they finally emerged from the woods, the sunlight was blinding. But the weight of the clearing, the symbols, and the whispers clung to them, a dark stain they couldn't wash away. And in Anna's mind, one question burned brighter than all the others. What had Logan found out here? The search party moved cautiously through the dense underbrush, their boots crunching against twigs and leaves dampened by the mist that refused to lift. It was an unearthly quiet, broken only by the occasional crackle of static from their radios. For hours, they had followed a trail that seemed to twist on itself, leading them deeper into Yosemite's untamed heart. The forest was alive, but not with the usual chorus of birds or the rustling of small creatures. Instead, there was a strange hum in the air, as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets they weren't meant to share. "Over here," a voice called out, urgent but restrained, as though afraid of disturbing the silence. The group hurried toward the sound. A young ranger, barely into his second year on the job, was crouched near a moss-covered rock. His gloved hand trembled as he held up a small, leather-bound notebook. It was unmistakable, Logan's journal. The cover was worn, scuffed from years of use, and the faint imprint of Yosemite's park logo was still visible. The team gathered around as the senior ranger, Morales, opened the journal. His face was a mask of forced calm, but his hands betrayed him, shaking ever so slightly. The pages were waterlogged, the ink smudged in places, but much of the writing was legible. At first, the entries were mundane. Notes about patrol routes, wildlife sightings, and weather conditions. Then, about halfway through, the tone shifted. May 9, 1995. Found an unmarked trail today. Strange. I thought I knew every inch of this park. It feels different. Quiet in a way that doesn't feel right. I'll mark the spot on the map and come back tomorrow. May 10, 1995. The trail is more overgrown than I remember. Like it's been hiding itself. Found some carvings on a tree. Don't recognize the symbols. Could be old native markings, but they're unusual. Almost geometric, like they don't belong here. I can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. Maybe it's just the isolation getting to me. May 11, 1995. I've been hearing things. Whispers in the wind. It's faint, but it's there. Tried calling it in, but the radio cut out. Static. The same pattern every time, like it's delivered it. I don't understand. I need to get back to the station, but the trail keeps shifting. Am I losing my mind? The writing became increasingly erratic, the letters jagged and hurried as if Logan had written them in a panic. Words were scrawled across the margins, repeating phrases like, "It knows," and "Don't look back." A crude sketch took up an entire page. A jagged spiral surrounded by the same strange symbols they had seen carved into the trees. "What the hell is this?" one of the rangers muttered, stepping back. "Ancient words," Morales said grimly, turning to the next page. May 12, 1995. "It's not just a forest. It's something deeper, older. I don't know how to describe it. The symbols, the whispers, they're everywhere now. I saw something last night. Just a shape, but it moved like nothing I've ever seen. My flashlight flickered when it passed. My compass doesn't work anymore. Nothing works. I'm not alone out here." The final entry was a single sentence, written in bold, jagged strokes that tore into the paper. Into the silence, the group exchanged uneasy glances. The forest around them suddenly felt oppressive, the mist clinging to their skin like a living thing. Morales closed the journal and held it tightly, as though afraid it might vanish if he let go. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Morgan's out there, and he's counting on us." One by one, they nodded, though none of them believed their own resolve. As they resumed their search, the trees seemed to close in tighter, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The forest no longer felt like Yosemite. It felt like something else entirely, something alive, ancient, and hungry. And as they pushed forward, faint whispers rose around them, just on the edge of hearing. They didn't dare acknowledge them. Not yet. Logan's boots crunched softly against the forest floor, the sound absorbed by the oppressive silence that had followed him for hours. The trail, if it could still be called that, had narrowed to a winding ribbon of earth tangled with roots and half hidden by damp moss. Every step felt heavier, the air thicker. The trees were no longer just trees. Their twisted forms seemed alive, their gnarled branches reaching, claw-like, toward him. Ahead, a faint glow pierced the suffocating gloom. Logan hesitated, his hand instinctively brushing against the cold steel of the radio strapped to his belt. He pressed the button, hoping for some kind of lifeline. Static crackle, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Then, just as he was about to release it, a voice, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, slid through the interference. "Logan!" He froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. It wasn't possible. The voice had been soft, almost kind, yet it carried an unnatural weight, as though it had been waiting for him. He spun around, scanning the trees, but the forest offered no answers. Only the glow ahead remained, drawing him closer like a moth to a flame. The trail widened abruptly, spilling into a clearing that didn't belong in this world. The trees encircled the space like sentinels, their dark trunks forming an impenetrable wall. At the center stood a ring of massive stones, their surfaces slick with moss and carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift under his gaze. The faint light he'd seen was emanating from the stones themselves, a pale, pulsating glow that flickered like dying embers. Logan stepped closer, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But something deeper, primal and irresistible, pushed him forward. His breath caught in his throat as he crossed the threshold of the stone circle. The moment he did, the air changed. It wasn't just thicker, it was alive, vibrating with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers brushing the surface of one of the stones. The moment he made contact, a jolt shot through him, as if the stone were a live wire. Images flooded his mind, fractured and fleeting, impossible to piece together. Faces he didn't recognize, places he'd never been, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The light from the stones pulsed brighter, and with it came a sound, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the ground beneath him. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was inside his skull. He stumbled backward, clutching his head, his knees hitting the damp earth. Then the whispers began. They came from everywhere and nowhere all at once, overlapping and chaotic, yet disturbingly clear. His name, over and over, mixed with words he couldn't understand but felt deep in his bones. He tried to cover his ears, but the whispers weren't external. They were inside him, burrowing into his mind like worms. Leave. Stay. Watch. Join. The words twisted and merged, their meaning slipping through his grasp like water. His vision blurred, the world around him distorting. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to sway, their forms stretching unnaturally, as if mocking his perception of reality. Logan's hands dropped to his sides as a calm washed over him, a calm that wasn't his own. He looked up and saw a shadow, darker than the night, standing just beyond the circle. It didn't move, but its presence pressed against him, heavy and undeniable. Its form was vague, shifting like smoke, but its eyes, yet they could be called eyes, burned with an otherworldly intensity. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The shadow tilted its head, as if studying him, then slowly raised an arm-like appendage. The hum grew deafening, and Logan's vision darkened at the edges. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the shadow stepping into the circle, its presence swallowing the light. And then silence. The clearing was wrong. Logan Mitchell couldn't explain it, but every instinct screamed at him to leave, to run back the way he came. Yet his legs felt heavy, as if the earth beneath him had grown hands, clutching at his boots. The forest had been unnerving before, with its twisted trees and unnatural silence, but this was something else. The stone circle stood at the center of the clearing, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer when he tried to focus on them. The stones themselves were ancient, weathered yet oddly intact, as though time had no power here. In the dim twilight, the air seemed thicker around the circle, bending the light and warping the edges of his vision. Logan reached for his radio, a desperate reflex. Stag greeted him again, but this time, it wasn't the empty kind. Beneath the crackle, there were whispers, soft, insistent, and speaking in a language he couldn't understand. He held the device closer to his ear, straining to make sense of the sounds, when suddenly his own name cut through the static. Logan! He froze, his blood running cold. The voice was faint, distant, and unmistakably his own. The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching across the clearing like grasping fingers. Logan checked his watch. It had stopped. The second hand hung limply at the 6, refusing to move. His phone was no better, the screen flickering erratically before going dark. He glanced around, trying to gather his bearings. The clearing, once clearly surrounded by dense forest, now seemed infinite. The trees receded into a gray haze that swallowed everything beyond a few dozen feet. Even the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustle of leaves, the chirp of distant birds, had vanished. "You're imagining things," he whispered to himself, his voice unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. As if in response, a low hum began to vibrate through the air. It wasn't audible so much as felt, a deep resonance that seemed to originate from the stones themselves. Logan instinctively stepped back, but the hum grew stronger, pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe. A shadow passed through the clearing, not on the ground, but in the air, like a ripple across water. Logan's eyes darted to the trees, searching for movement, but there was nothing. He turned back to the stones and froze. The symbols were glowing now, faintly effaced, but growing brighter with each passing second. Their light wasn't natural. It was cold, almost hungry, casting jagged shadows across the clearing. The hum became a low, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat echoing in his ears. Logan clutched his chest, gasping for air. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw shades moving within the circle. They were indistinct, shadowy figures, but they felt familiar, too familiar. One of them turned, and he swore he was looking at him. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The figures didn't answer. Instead, the whispers returned, louder this time, layering over one another until they became an incomprehensible cacophony. Logan staggered backward, clutching his head. "Stop!" he yelled, but the voices only grew louder. Logan fell to his knees, gripping the dirt as if anchoring himself to reality. The ground was warm, almost pulsing, as though the earth itself was alive. He could feel it beneath his palms, an energy that throbbed with an unnatural rhythm. He looked up, and the clearing had changed again. The stones now towered over him, impossibly large, their symbols blazing like fire. The figures within the circle moved closer, their forms becoming sharper. Logan's breath hitched as he recognized one of them. It was his father, long dead, staring at him with hollow eyes. "Dad?" Logan whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but it raised a hand, beckoning him forward. The other shapes followed suit, their faces now distinct. His sister, his childhood friend, even his own reflection. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're not real. None of this is real." But the clearing begged to differ. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath him began to quake. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. Logan stumbled to his feet, his legs wobbling like jelly. The circle seemed to pulse with life, each beat drawing him closer despite his resistance. His father's hand stretched out further, his reflection's mouth opening as if to speak. "Come with us, Logan," the whispers said in unison, their tone almost pleading. He backed away, shaking his head. "I can't. I won't." The circle erupted in blinding light, and for a moment, everything disappeared. Logan, the clearing, the stones, even the sky. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. The search team stood at the edge of the clearing, a vast circle of flattened earth, where no grass dared to grow. The air here felt different, denser, heavier, as if it resisted their every breath. The towering pines that formed the perimeter seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the center. And there, in the middle of the barren expanse, was Logan's ranger hat. It was perfectly placed, sitting upright and undisturbed, as if someone had deliberately set it there. Around it, strange symbols were etched into the ground, spiraling outward in a chaotic yet mesmerizing pattern. The symbols matched those the team had seen carved into the trees earlier, their sharp, angular lines cutting into the dirt like wounds. "Is that his?" whispered Jensen, the youngest member of the team, his voice trembling. The others didn't answer. They were too busy scanning the clearing, their flashlights barely piercing the unnerving gloom that seemed to defy the daylight filtering through the canopy above. The forest here was silent, not a bird, not an insect, not even the rustle of leaves. Just silence, thick and oppressive, wrapping around them like a shroud. Taylor, the team leader, took a hesitant step forward. "Stay together," he ordered, though his voice betrayed a crack of unease. The team advanced slowly, their boots crunching softly against the dry earth. The clearing felt wrong, like a place not meant to be found. As they approached the hut, the symbols on the ground seemed to shift under the beam of their flashlights, their edges flickering as if alive. "It's him," muttered Sarah, the station's veteran tracker, crouching to examine the hut. Her gloved hand hovered above it, reluctant to touch. "It's Logan's, no doubt. But where is he?" Jensen asked, his voice rising with a mix of fear and frustration. Sarah shook her head, her eyes darting around the clearing. No tracks, no signs of struggle. "It's like he vanished." A cold wind swept through the clearing, sudden and biting, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was too soft to discern the words, but every member of the team froze. The whisper wasn't from the wind. It had a cadence, an intent. "Did you hear that?" Jensen's flashlight quivered in his hand. "It's just the wind," Taylor snapped, though his tone lacked conviction. "No, it's not," Sarah countered, standing abruptly. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Something's here." The team instinctively drew closer together, their flashlights darting toward the tree line. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of their vision, shades that disappeared when they tried to focus on them. Jensen took a step back, his boot catching on something. He stumbled and fell, his flashlight skidding across the ground. "Damn it!" he cursed, fumbling in the dark. "Stay calm," Taylor barked, reaching down to help him up. But as Jensen stood, he froze, his face pale. "There's something out there," he stammered, pointing toward the trees. The others turned, their beams converging on the spot he indicated. For a moment, they saw nothing but the endless forest. Then, a figure emerged, or perhaps it had always been there, lurking in the shadows. It was indistinct, more a suggestion of a shape than a tangible presence. But its eyes, or what should have been its eyes, glowed faintly, an unnatural amber light that sent a chill through the group. "Who's there?" Taylor called out, though his voice wavered. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. The sheer weight of its presence pressed down on them, a primal fear that bypassed logic and reason. "We need to go," Sarah said, her voice firm but hushed. "Now!" Taylor hesitated, torn between his duty to find Logan and the instinct screaming at him to run. Another whisper rippled through the air, louder this time, carrying with it a distinct word: "Leave." That was enough. "Fall back," Taylor ordered, his voice urgent. The team retreated, their movements hurried but careful, their flashlights darting wildly as they scanned for any sign of pursuit. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Taylor turned back for one last glance. The hut was still there, untouched, a lonely marker in the vast, silent expanse. But the figure was gone, or perhaps it had never been there at all. As they re-entered the dense forest, the oppressive weight began to lift, replaced by the familiar sounds of the woods. For his chart, knees rustled. The world returned to normal, as if the clearing had been a pocket of unreality sealed off from time. But the team's unease lingered. They didn't speak as they made their way back to the station, their minds replaying the strange events over and over. Each of them wondered the same thing, but dared not voice it. Had they just stumbled into something no human was meant to find? And if so, what had they left behind in that clearing, besides Logan's hat? As the trees closed around them, the clearing remained behind, untouched and unclaimed. The symbols etched into the earth pulsed faintly, as if breathing, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to step inside. The forest was alive with an unnatural stillness, the kind that pressed against eardrums and made the breath feel heavy in the chest. The search team, now reduced to 5 members after one ranger claimed to feel watched and locked in fear, trudged cautiously through the dense thickets of Yosemite's remote wilderness. The sunlight had begun to fade, casting long shadows that danced with every movement of the trees. For the first time since Logan's disappearance, the searchers began to feel a profound sense of vulnerability. Anna Blake, the team leader, adjusted the strap of her pack and scanned the woods with her flashlight, its beam struggling to pierce the encroaching gloom. She called out, her voice firm but not without an edge of anxiety. "Logan, and you can hear me respond?" The only reply was the rustling of leaves in the faint evening breeze. Then a sound, a whisper, not quite a voice, but not natural either. It came from the left, faint and fleeting, like the sigh of wind through hollow bones. Anna froze, holding up a hand to signal the others. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason, the youngest ranger, nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, it sounded like someone saying something." Anna tightened her grip on her flashlight. "Stay together. Keep moving." The team pressed on, but unease had crept into their formation. Jason stayed close to Anna, his head jerking at every snap of a twig. Behind them, Eddie, the most experienced of the group, muttered a prayer under his breath. They approached a small clearing, its boundary marked by a ring of ancient oaks. The trees seemed unnaturally uniform, their gnarled branches twisting together overhead to form a kind of canopy that blocked the last remnants of daylight. The whispering grew louder as they stepped into the clearing, now unmistakably human-like, though the words were garbled and unintelligible. "Anna, stop," Eddie said, his voice low but urgent. "Biz, this doesn't feel right." Anna turned to him, her jaw clenched. "We're here to find Logan, not speculate about how the forest feels. Keep moving." But Jason wasn't moving. He stood rigid, staring at something in the shadows just beyond the clearing. His hand trembled as he raised his flashlight, the beam shaking as it illuminated a figure, a human silhouette, barely visible, standing impossibly still. "There," Jason whispered hoarsely. "Do you see it? Someone standing there." Anna swung her flashlight in the direction Jason pointed, but the beam revealed only trees and underbrush. She looked back at Jason, his face now etched with terror. "There was someone there," he insisted, his voice cracking. "I swear I saw them." Before Anna could respond, the whispering crescendoed, surrounding them from every direction. It was louder now, a mix of voices overlapping, rising and falling like the tide. Some were desperate, others angry, all of them unintelligible yet filled with intent. "Anna!" Eddie shouted, his voice breaking the spell. "We have to go now." But Anna hesitated. Her eyes darted across the clearing, searching for any trace of Logan. Then, just as she was about to order the team to retreat, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on them like a weight. "Listen," Jason said, his voice a trembling whisper. "It's quiet. Too quiet." Suddenly, from the edge of the clearing, came a sound that didn't belong. A deep, guttural growl, low and resonant, vibrating through the air. It was not the sound of any animal Anna had ever encountered in her years in Yosemite. It was primal, otherworldly. "Malov!" Anna barked, snapping into action. back the way we came now." The team turned and bolted, their flashlights swinging wildly as they ran. The growl followed, growing louder, accompanied by the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jason tripped, falling to the ground with a cry. Anna skidded to a halt and helped him up, her heart pounding. "Keep going," she urged, her voice strained. As they broke through the dense trees and back onto the marked trail, the noises stopped as abruptly as they had started. The route staggered to a halt, gasping for breath. For a long moment, no one spoke. What was that?" Jason finally asked, his voice shaking. "That wasn't an animal. It couldn't have been." Anna didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was racing, trying to rationalize what they had just experienced. She looked back into the forest, the shadows now impenetrable in the darkness. "We regroup," she said firmly, her voice masking the fear clawing at her chest. "We report what we found, and we come back with more support." Eddie shook his head. "Come back? Anna, whatever that was, it doesn't want us here. And if Logan, if he found it," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Anna stared into the void of the forest, the trees whispering secrets only they could hear. She wasn't ready to give up on Logan, but she couldn't ignore the growing dread that maybe, just maybe, he had stumbled into something no one was ever meant to find. The ranger station was quiet that morning, cloaked in an uneasy stillness that seemed to echo the vast wilderness beyond its walls. It had been nearly 3 weeks since Logan Mitchell vanished, and the park's routine had grown somber. The search was officially over, the helicopters grounded, the search dogs called back, and the makeshift headquarters dismantled. Yet, for the remaining rangers, Logan's absence lingered like a shadow in the corners of every room. Maria Gutierrez, a veteran ranger who had worked alongside Logan for years, was the first to arrive that day. She stepped into the dimly lit station, her booth scuffing against the old wooden floor. The familiar scent of coffee grounds and damp earth greeted her, but so did an unusual chill in the air. She rubbed her arms, shivering despite the spring warmth outside. Maria moved instinctively toward the lockers, intending to retrieve some gear before her morning rounds. Logan's locker, untouched since his disappearance, caught her eye. It stood slightly ajar, its door swaying faintly as though disturbed by a draft. She frowned. "No one's touched his things," she muttered under her breath, stepping closer. Her fingers hesitated on the cold metal handle. It felt wrong to open it, like trespassing on something sacred. But the door seemed to invite her, almost beckon her. Against her better judgment, she pulled it open. The faint creak of the hinges seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet station. Inside, everything was as it should have been. Logan's spare uniform hung neatly on a hook, his hiking boots lined up below. Yet, at the center of the bottom shelf, something caught her eye, a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. Maria crouched, her heart quickening as she reached for it. It was a map. She unfolded it carefully, her fingers trembling. The map was pristine, its edges crisp, as if it had just been printed. It was a detailed topographical map of Yosemite, identical to the ones issued to all rangers. But as her eyes scanned the familiar contours and landmarks, a detail stood out. A small, hand-drawn symbol in black ink near the base of El Capitan. The symbol was unnerving. A perfect circle, bisected by jagged, almost lightning-like lines that radiated outward. It wasn't a trail marker, nor anything she had seen in her years at the park. Beneath it, In Logan's unmistakable handwriting were the words, "Not alone." Maria's breath caught in her throat. She turned the map over, looking for more clues, but the back was blank. She glanced toward the open locker again, her mind racing. How could this have gotten here? The Rangers had searched Logan's locker thoroughly in the days after his disappearance. It had been empty. She was certain of it. Her pulse quickened as she tried to rationalize the impossible. Had someone placed it there as a cruel joke? The search team had been plagued by growing superstitions, whispers of the forest harboring something malevolent. But Maria dismissed such thoughts. There had to be a logical explanation. Gripping the map tightly, she hurried to the main office, where her supervisor, Ranger David Harper, was working through a stack of paperwork. He looked up as she entered, his eyes tired and sunken. "Maria? What's wrong?" he asked, setting his pen down. Wordlessly, she handed him the map. Harper's brow furrowed as he unfolded it. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of the symbol and the chilling note scrawled beneath it. "Where did you find us?" he demanded, his voice low but urgent. "In Logan's locker," Marie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't there before." "I'm sure of it." Harper leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He studied the map for a long moment before speaking. "This doesn't make sense. It's been weeks. If someone had access to his locker, we'd know. The place has been locked up tighter than a vault since the search ended." Maria felt a wave of unease wash over her. "What does the symbol mean? Had you seen it before?" Harper shook his head. "No." "Why?" He hesitated, his gaze distant. "Logan mentioned something once. A few months back, during a late-night patrol. He said he found markings in the forest, symbols carved into trees. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was just kids' war. I don't know." Maria's heart sank. The symbols. The ones the search team had found etched into the trees near the clearing. The same symbols that had led them to Logan's hat, lying eerily in the center of that stone circle. "Do you think it's connected?" she asked. "I don't know what to think," Harper admitted. "But this." He tapped the map with a finger. "This isn't normal." As the two rangers stared at the cryptic map, the station's radio crackled to life. A burst of static filled the room, followed by a faint, fragmented voice. Both Maria and Harper froze, their eyes locked on the radio as the voice grew clearer. It was Logan. "Help!" The voice whispered, distorted but unmistakable. "Knife! Alone! Here!" Then silence. Maria's blood ran cold. Harper grabbed the radio, barking into it. "Logan? Logan, if you can hear me, respond. Where are you?" No reply. Only the empty hum of static. Maria clutched the map tighter, her knuckles white. The symbol seemed to mock her now, its meaning tantalizingly out of reach. Somewhere, deep in the wilderness, Logan's voice had broken through. But was it truly him? Or had the forest claimed more than just his body? As the sun rose higher over Yosemite, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The map was not a clue, it was a warning. And whatever had marked it wanted them to know. The forest held secrets that would never let go. The sun hung low in the sky, its warm hues splintering through the dense canopy of Yosemite's ancient trees. It marked the 15th day since Logan Mitchell had vanished. Despite the relentless efforts of search teams, helicopters, and even bloodhounds, no trace of him had surfaced beyond the bizarre artifacts they'd already uncovered. The once hopeful mission to find a missing ranger had become a grim ritual, as those involved began to dread the forest rather than conquer it. By now, the search had taken its toll on the team. Ranger Matt Calder, Logan's closest colleague, trudged along a familiar trail, his boots crunching the brittle underbrush. His eyes, bloodshot from sleepless nights, scanned the horizon for any sign of movement. But all he saw were shadows that danced unnaturally, as if mocking his persistence. "This is a right," Calder muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the unnerving quiet. He stopped abruptly and looked around, realizing he was alone. The rest of the team had fallen behind, deliberately lingering closer to the ranger station, unwilling to venture as far into the wilderness as Calder dared. The deeper Calder went, the more distorted the forest became. The trees seemed to lean inward, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes. The air carried a peculiar charge, as if a storm were perpetually on the brink of breaking. Yet the sky remained an empty expanse of pale blue, devoid of clouds. Back at the command center, Ranger Ellie Vargas and the lead investigator, Sheriff Dean Colton, sat in tense silence, poring over maps and photographs. Vargas stared at a satellite image of Yosemite, her finger tracing the path Logan had last reported. "This is where the trail just ends," she said, tapping the map. "There's no logical reason he wouldn't have circled back. Even if he got disoriented, his gear would have let him out." Colton sighed and leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his stubbled face. "I've been in law enforcement for 30 years. Seen my share of missing persons cases. But this," he gestured to the table cluttered with evidence. The flashlight, the notebook with its cryptic drawings, the pristine map found back at the station. "This doesn't add up." "None of it does." Vargas hesitated before speaking. "The guys on the team, they're saying things. About the forest. About something watching them." Colton scoffed, but avoided her gaze. "You don't really believe that, do you?" "I don't know what I believe anymore," Vargas admitted. "But something's not right out there. You've felt it too, haven't you?" Colton didn't respond, his silence louder than any denial. As night fell, Calder finally reached the clearing. It was just as the others had described, a perfect circle of stone, etched with those strange, otherworldly symbols. In the moonlight, the carving seemed to glow faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. Calder's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the center of the clearing, was Logan's hat, the brim slightly curled from wear. Calder froze, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but his legs refused to obey. "Logan?" he called out, his voice trembling. The sound echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the trees and returning to him distorted, as if the forest were mimicking him. A low hum began to fill the air, barely perceptible at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. Calder dropped his flashlight, its beam casting wild shadows as it rolled to a stop. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding. And then the hum stopped. Silence enveloped the clearing, heavier than before. Calder turned and ran, his breast ragged, his feet barely finding purchase on the uneven ground. He didn't stop until he saw the lights of the ranger station, and even then, he felt the forest's gaze burning into his back. By the end of the week, the search was officially called off. The authorities cited the wilderness's inherent dangers and the statistical likelihood of survival after so many days. Logan Mitchell was declared missing, presumed dead. At the ranger station, the mood was somber. Maps and photographs were packed away, replaced by the dull paperwork that marked the end of the case. Yet, among the rangers, whispers persisted. Stories of strange dreams, of hearing Logan's voice calling to them from the trees. Vargas found herself standing alone one evening, staring at the clearing marked on the map. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had left something unfinished, that the forest wasn't done with them yet. Some places, she whispered to herself, aren't meant to be found. As she turned off the light and left the room, the map remained on the table, the clearing at its center. And though no one was there to see it, the faint glow of the symbol seemed to return, pulsating softly in the dark. The fog rolled into Yosemite Valley like a silent tide, swallowing the towering pines and granite cliffs in a ghostly shroud. It had been years since Logan Mitchell had disappeared, yet his name lingered in the air like an unfinished whisper, carried on the breeze through the park's uncharted trails. At the ranger station, a newer generation of park employees had taken up the mantle of preserving Yosemite's majesty. But even they, hardened by their training and the grueling hours of patrol, spoke in hushed tones about Logan. His case was never officially solved, and the mystery clung to the park like the stubborn moss on the ancient sequoias. For those who worked the night shifts, the stories of Logan weren't just tales, they were warnings. Ranger Elena Hayes, a rookie only months into her post, was on the late patrol that evening. She had heard the tales of Logan's disappearance during her training but dismissed them as exaggerated campfire stories. But tonight, something about the atmosphere unsettled her. The usual cacophony of nocturnal life, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of underbrush, was eerily absent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elena adjusted her flashlight as she approached the edge of the forest near the location where Logan's trail had ended. She had volunteered for this particular patrol, curious and defiant in equal measure. Her colleagues had warned her of it, citing vague but unnerving accounts of strange occurrences. "Nothing but shadows and paranoia," she muttered, as if trying to convince herself. But then she sighed, a faint glow through the trees. Her heart skipped. It wasn't the warm orange of a campfire or the artificial glare of a headlamp. This light was cold, silvery, pulsating faintly, as if breathing in the dark. Against her better judgment, Elena moved closer. At the base of an ancient pine, she found it, an old ranger's badge, tarnished and weathered. She crouched down to inspect it, brushing away the damp moss clinging to its surface. The name etched into the metal sent a chill down her spine. Logan Mitchell. "Count," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. Before she could process the find, the forest seemed to react. The trees creaked, their branches groaning as if stretching toward her. A low hum began to vibrate through the ground beneath her boots. It wasn't mechanical, it was organic, resonating with a rhythm that seemed to match her own heartbeat. Elena stumbled back, clutching the badge as though it were a talisman. The light she had seen earlier was gone, replaced by an oppressive darkness. She fumbled for her radio, her voice shaky as she called the station. "Hayes to base. I found something. I think it belonged to Logan Mitchell." Static crackled in response, followed by a voice, not the familiar timbre of her colleagues, but something distant, fragmented. It whispered her name, low and guttural, like the wind through a hollow tree. Almeida. The tales about Logan's disappearance had often included whispers, accounts of voices that mimicked the living but didn't belong to them. Elena had laughed those off before, but now her pulse raced. She spun around, her flashlight slicing through the shadows, but there was no one there. She began retracing her steps, the badge clutched tightly in her hand. The forest felt alive now, shifting and reshaping around her. Trails she was certain she had walked minutes earlier now led in different directions. She stumbled into a grove she didn't recognize, its trees marked with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under her light. It was then she heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice echoing through the stillness. No response came, but the footsteps stopped. The silence was heavier now, pressing against her like a physical weight. In that moment, Elena understood what the others had meant. The forest wasn't just vast, it was aware. Elena made it back to the station just as dawn broke, her face pale and her hands trembling. She handed the badge over to her supervisor, who stared at it in stunned silence. "Where did you find us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena recounted her experience, leaving out the whisper that had spoken her name. She didn't want to sound crazy, not yet. The supervisor, a veteran ranger who had been there during Logan's time, shook his head slowly. "Funny," he said finally. "Burn it and don't go back there." But the badge wasn't burned. Instead, it found its way into a locked drawer in the station, where it joined other relics of Yosemite's unexplainable history. A map with an unrecognizable symbol, a flashlight that still glowed faintly despite its age, and a notebook filled with drawings of something ancient and unknowable. Elena never patrolled the area again, and the badge became another piece of the growing legend of Logan Mitchell. In the months that followed, campers and hikers reported strange lights near the clearing. Some claimed to hear whispers. Others swore they saw a figure in the fog wearing a ranger's uniform. Logan's name was now more than a cautionary tale. It was a warning etched into Yosemite's lore. And deep within the forest, the presence that had claimed him remained, waiting for its next visitor. The forest was quiet that morning, a stillness so profound it seemed to press against the ears. Jake Turner, a seasoned camper, tightened the straps of his backpack as he stood on the edge of Yosemite's wilderness. It was his annual solo retreat, a week of disconnecting from the chaos of city life to find solace in the towering pines and granite cliffs. But this time, the forest felt different. The first 2 days had been uneventful, marked by long hikes and quiet nights under the stars. On the third day, while trekking along an overgrown trail near El Capitan, Jake noticed a faint shimmer in the underbrush. He crouched down, brushing away a layer of leaves and dirt, and unearthed an old flashlight. Its metal casing was weathered and rusted, the lens clouded, yet oddly, the battery compartment was sealed tight, as if untouched by time. Curiosity tugged at him. Who had left it here? And why hadn't it been reclaimed? The forest seemed to shift as Jake held the flashlight. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees like a collective exhale. He stood and glanced around. The trail ahead stretched into shadow, the dense canopy blotting out the sunlight. A faint chill crept up his spine, but he shook it off and continued, clutching the flashlight as if it held some significance he couldn't quite place. As evening fell, Jake set up camp in a small clearing. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. He examined the flashlight under the firelight, turning it over in his hands. Etched faintly into the metal casing was a series of markings, lines and curves forming a symbol he didn't recognize. His thoughts turned to the stories he'd heard about this part of Yosemite, tales of missing hikers and unexplained phenomena. He chuckled nervously, dismissing them as ranger campfire lore. Still, the flashlight felt heavy in his hands, as if it carried a history too weighty to dismiss. That night, he dreamed of shadows moving between trees, their shapes indistinct but undeniably there. A voice called his name, soft at first, then insistent. "Jake." He woke with a start. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that felt alive. He strained his ears, certain he had heard something, a voice, distant but clear, calling his name again. "Jake." He turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. It came from deeper in the forest, from a direction he hadn't explored. Against every instinct, he grabbed his flashlight and aimed it into the darkness. The beam flickered, weak but functional, illuminating the gnarled trunks of trees and the faint outline of a trail. He hesitated. "Kalong?" His voice wavered, swallowed almost instantly by the vastness of the night. The voice came again, closer now. "Jake." It was not a cry for help. It was calm, almost melodic, as if whoever, or whatever, spoke his name knew him intimately. Against his better judgment, Jake stepped off the clearing and followed the sound. The trail was narrower here, overgrown and unfamiliar. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The flashlight flickered again, casting fleeting shadows that danced at the edges of his vision. The voice guided him, repeating his name, each utterance laced with a strange familiarity that sent shivers down his spine. The forest grew denser, the air heavy with the scent of moss and decay. He stumbled into another clearing and froze. At its center stood a stone circle, the ground within its bounds unnaturally smooth. Symbols identical to those on the flashlight were carved into the stones, glowing faintly in the darkness. The air buzzed with a low hum, a vibration that resonated in his chest. Jake felt drawn to the circle, his body moving as if compelled by an unseen force. As he stepped closer, the hum grew louder, and the voice, Logan's voice, spoke again. "Jake, you found it." He turned in every direction, searching for the source. There was no one, only the whispering wind and the silent stones. But the voice didn't fade. Instead, it surrounded him, enveloping him like a cocoon. Images flashed through his mind. A man in a ranger's uniform standing in this very clearing, his face obscured by shadow. Symbols etched in blood on bark. A flashlight left as a marker, as if to warn or guide. And then, a final whisper, softer than the others, filled with an overwhelming sadness. "Run." The ground beneath Jake trembled. The glow from the stones intensified, casting the clearing in an eerie light. He stumbled back, dropping the flashlight as the vibration grew to a deafening roar. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching for him like skeletal hands. Jake ran. Branches tore at his clothes and skin as he sprinted through the forest, the voice echoing behind him, now pleading, now commanding. "Run. Don't look back." He didn't. When he finally burst into the open, gasping for breath, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. He collapsed on the ground, clutching the earth as if to anchor himself to reality. The flashlight was gone. In the years that followed, Jake never returned to Yosemite. He told no one about the night, but every so often, he would wake in the dead of night, his heart racing, the faint echo of a voice whispering his name. Somewhere deep in Yosemite, the stone circle waits, and the forest never forgets.